At 4:30 in the afternoon, a group of friends pulled away from an island off the Mississippi coast and left one of their own behind. Nolan Wells was 18. He'd chosen to stay a little longer with a girl he'd just met that day, planning to catch a later ride-in. That was the last ordinary moment in the story. Everything after it, the search, the calls, the funeral, the six-figure fundraiser, the lawsuit, happened because of a decision that, on any other day, would have meant nothing at all. He never came home. And in the time it took for that fact to travel from a family's private nightmare to a national argument about race and money and who deserves to be believed, something strange happened. The actual question, what happened to Nolan Wells, got smaller and smaller, buried under everything everyone else needed it to mean. By the time you finish this video, you may notice the same thing we did putting it together. Almost nobody left in this fight is still talking about him. We want to say plainly right at the start what this video is and isn't. This is not a video that's going to tell you what happened to Nolan on that island, because nobody outside the actual investigation knows that yet, not the pastor who preached about it, not the talk show host who fought back, not the attorneys drafting 19-page letters, and not us. What we can tell you is everything that's happened since. How a grieving mother's search for answers collided with three teenagers' fight to clear their names, how a fundraiser meant to bury a son turned into its own national controversy, and how, somewhere in the middle of all of it, one of the most famous civil rights figures in America ended up on the receiving end of a defamation threat from a group of kids who, 2 months ago, nobody outside their hometown had ever heard of. Let's start with the plain facts almost everyone actually agrees on, because there aren't many, and it's worth being precise about exactly where that agreement runs out. Nolan Wells went out on the water on the 4th of July, on a day when a large number of people had the same idea. This wasn't an isolated dock with 5 kids and 1 boat. Court and news reporting on this case describes roughly 300 people gathered on Horn Island that day, spread across a rotating cast of boats coming and going from the mainland, a real crowd, but a far smaller and more traceable one than some of the online commentary around this case has claimed, with figures as high as 1,000 or 2,000 people circulating in less careful retellings. That distinction matters, because a 300-person gathering is something investigators can realistically canvass witness by witness. A 2,000-person gathering would not be. GPS data reviewed in this case shows the boat carrying Nolan and his friends left a private dock in Ocean Springs at 9:56 in the morning and reached Horn Island by 11:14. The last confirmed photograph of Nolan alive shows him on a boat with 2 older adults at 2:23 that afternoon. Sometime after that, according to the account given by his friends, Nolan chose to stay behind on the island with a young woman he'd met that day, while the larger group he'd arrived with began preparing to head home. At some point around 4 in the afternoon, one of the teens on that departing boat called Seatow to report the boat was taking on water. The boat received assistance from another vessel and finally left the island at 4:31, arriving back at the mainland dock by 6:06 that evening, without Nolan aboard. The 3 young men who traveled with Nolan that day, identified in public reporting and in their own attorney's statements as Warren Hudson, Jack Spatalo, and Morgan Seymour, have given an account consistent with that timeline, that Nolan was last seen alive around 3 that afternoon, and that he chose to remain on the island rather than leave with them. It's worth being precise, though, about where that account stands relative to everyone else's. Nolan's mother and at least one of his friends, Javen Williams, have publicly questioned whether Nolan would really have chosen to separate from his friend group that way, and attorney Ben Crump has pointed to what he's described as conflicting statements, including an account from a young woman at the party who reportedly told investigators Nolan actually did return to the boat with the others, directly contradicting the account Warren, Jax, and Morgan have given. That contradiction, as of this video, has not been publicly resolved one way or the other. It sits at the center of everything that follows. What happened between 4:30 that afternoon and whatever hour Nolan was reported missing is the actual empty space at the center of this entire story. Nobody watching from the outside, not us, not the commentators arguing about it online, not the family supporters, not the boys' defenders, actually knows what filled that gap. The official autopsy is now complete, and its findings are sealed, awaiting presentation to a grand jury that has not yet concluded its review, meaning no charges, formal or otherwise, have been filed against anyone as of this video. That single fact is worth holding on to through everything else you're about to hear, because a great deal of what has been said publicly about this case, on both sides, has been said with far more certainty than the actual, currently public record supports. Warren has said, through his attorneys, that he called Nolan's mother, Christine Wells Wansley, that night, and that he separately contacted the Coast Guard and later local law enforcement. A timeline of phone calls has been circulated publicly. An 11 o'clock call to Christine Wells Wansley, contact with the Coast Guard roughly 6 minutes later, a second Coast Guard contact around midnight, and a call from Christine back to Warren around 1 a.m, after which Sheriff's Department contact reportedly followed. We want to be careful here, because that timeline, as it's been presented in commentary and in what's described as an attorney's letter, has not been independently verified by us, and we're presenting it the way it has been presented publicly, as the boys' documented account of their own actions that night, not as an independently confirmed record. Before we go any further, it's worth pausing on something that will matter for almost everything else in this video: the sheer number of people who now have a stake in how this story gets told. There is Nolan's family, obviously, at the center of an unimaginable loss. There are 3 young men, Warren Hudson, Jack Spatalo, and Morgan Seymour, who were with Nolan earlier that day and who are now, by their own attorney's account, receiving threats serious enough that some of them have reportedly resulted in arrests. There is a civil rights attorney's office. There is a nationally known pastor. There is a nationally known activist. There is a talk show host with his own media brand who has built a significant part of his recent programming around pushing back on all of it. And there is an audience of millions of people online, most of whom have never met anyone involved, forming and sharing opinions about who deserves blame for the death of an 18-year-old they never knew. Keep that list in your head. Almost every piece of this story from here forward runs through one or more of those parties, and almost every one of them has something to gain or lose from which version of this story the public settles on. If you want the fuller, document-level version of cases like this one, not just the loudest clip circulating that week, but the actual letters, the actual timelines, the actual legal filings, that's the kind of coverage this channel is built around. It helps more than you'd think if you subscribe before you keep watching, simply so more videos like this one reach people who want the slower, more careful version of a story like this. Okay, back to Nolan. Let's talk about who Nolan Wells actually was, before this case became an argument about race, money, and lawsuits, because it is easy, watching the online fight this case has generated, to lose track of the fact that an 18-year-old is actually dead, and that everyone shouting at each other online is, in theory, doing it because they care about that fact. Nolan Xavier Wells was born on August 19, 2007, raised in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, and graduated from Ocean Springs High School in 2025. At the time of his death, he was attending Southwest Mississippi Community College, where he played wide receiver on the football team, a young man with an athletic career still ahead of him, in the middle of the ordinary, hopeful business of being a college freshman. Multiple people close to him, friends, family, people who appeared alongside his mother in public interviews, have described him as well-liked, present at that 4th of July gathering because he had a wide circle of friends there, the kind of young man whose absence was noticed almost immediately because so many people expected to see him. His football program at Southwest Mississippi Community College, like most college athletic programs facing the death of a current player, would ordinarily be expected to mark that loss in some public way, a moment of silence before the season's games, a jersey number retired or honored, a scholarship or memorial fund established in his name. We don't have independent confirmation of exactly what his specific program has done, and we're not going to invent detail we don't have there either. But it's worth naming that Nolan's death didn't just leave a hole in one household. It left a hole in a locker room, a roster, a coaching staff's plans for a season, and a community of teammates who, unlike millions of strangers arguing about this case online, actually knew him as a specific person with a specific voice and a specific sense of humor, not as a name attached to a controversy. We don't have independent access to who Nolan was as a person beyond what's been said publicly by people who loved him, and we're not going to invent detail we don't have. But it's worth saying plainly once, before we get into the parts of his story that have nothing to do with him personally at all, whatever else this case becomes, it began with the death of a specific 18-year-old human being, about 6 weeks shy of what would have been his 19th birthday, not a symbol for either side of an online argument to fight over. Now let's talk about the money, because more than almost anything else, the money is what turned this from a local tragedy into a national spectacle, and it's the piece of the story that both sides now agree matters, even though they disagree completely on what it means. A GoFundMe organized in the aftermath of Nolan's disappearance and death had raised more than $320,000 within the first 2 weeks, boosted in part by a $100,000 donation from media producer Byron Allen, and reporting on the case, since has cited figures climbing well beyond that as the case continued to draw national attention. The specific, current total, as of this video, is not something we can independently confirm down to the dollar, so we're not going to state one more precisely than the reporting actually supports. That is, regardless of the exact figure, an extraordinary amount of money for a GoFundMe tied to a single family's loss, the kind of total that, by itself, guarantees national attention because a fundraiser of that size becomes newsworthy independent of the underlying tragedy. What is well documented is that several of the largest, most visible expenses tied to Nolan's death were covered separately by high-profile donors rather than out of the GoFundMe itself. Tyler Perry publicly committed to covering funeral costs, Colin Kaepernick's initiative funded the family's independent autopsy, and Reverend Al Sharpton, who delivered Nolan's eulogy at the July 20th funeral, pledged a $50,000 reward for information about Nolan's death, which Perry then matched, bringing the total reward on offer to $100,000. That distinction matters enormously for what comes next, because the entire "where did the money go" line of questioning that has driven so much of this case's online attention rests on an assumption that may or may not hold up. That if the funeral, the second autopsy, and the eulogy were covered by outside donors rather than the GoFundMe, then a very large sum of money raised specifically in Nolan's name has gone toward something other than what many small donors likely assumed they were. Funding. That is a genuinely fair question to ask about any large public fundraiser tied to a tragedy. Transparency about how donated funds get used is a real, legitimate public interest, not an inherently hostile one. It becomes a different kind of question, though, the moment it gets asked not as, can the family share an accounting of these funds, but as an accusation that the family is deliberately profiting from their son's death, a much more serious claim that, as of this video, has not been supported by anything beyond suspicion and pattern matching to other high-profile cases. It's worth explaining, in general terms, what GoFundMe campaigns like this one are actually allowed to be used for, because there's a common public misconception that a fundraiser tied to a death has to be spent exclusively on burial costs, or else something improper has happened. In reality, GoFundMe's own terms give organizers considerably more latitude than that, provided the funds go toward purposes reasonably connected to the stated cause, and platforms like this one generally do not require organizers to publish a line-by-line accounting unless a formal complaint or fraud investigation is opened. Funds from a fundraiser like this can, within that framework, reasonably go toward legal fees, toward a family's living expenses if a parent has had to step away from work during an investigation and its aftermath, toward mental health support, toward a wrongful death case's own investigative and expert costs if the family pursues one, and toward ordinary costs of daily life that don't stop simply because a family is grieving. None of that is inherently improper. It also means that the family isn't going back to work is not, on its own, evidence of wrongdoing. It can just as easily reflect and genuinely incapacitating grief, or a strategic decision tied to preparing for a civil case, and there is no way to know from the outside which explanation applies here, or whether it's some combination of both. At the same time, it's fair to say plainly that a fundraiser of this size, attached to a case this publicly contested, creates a real incentive for scrutiny that a smaller, quieter fundraiser wouldn't generate, and families who accept large public donations in a highly visible case should reasonably expect that scrutiny, uncomfortable as it may be, rather than treating every question about the money as an attack. Both things can be true at once. The family may have done nothing improper with a single dollar of it, and the public may still have a legitimate interest in knowing, in general terms, where roughly $750,000 raised in a teenager's name actually went. Now let's talk about Ben Crump, because his involvement is one of the single most contested facts in this entire story, and it's worth understanding both what his role actually is and why his mere presence has become such a flashpoint. Benjamin Crump is one of the most prominent civil rights attorneys in the country, known for representing families in high-profile wrongful death cases, frequently ones involving allegations of racial injustice, and for securing some of the largest civil settlements in the country's recent legal history, settlements that, across his career, have run from the tens of millions into the hundreds of millions of dollars in some of his most prominent cases. According to Christine Wells GoFundMe, in her own account given on a podcast appearance, the decision to bring in Crump's team came out of a moment of prayer with her husband shortly after Nolan's death. She has described it as asking for whoever needed to come into their life to help them navigate what was happening, and Crump's team then becoming involved. She and her husband have also stated directly, more than once, that Crump's team did not initially reach out to them, the clear implication being that they sought Crump out, not the other way around. Beyond Crump's team, the NAACP formally joined Nolan's legal effort in August, a development worth explaining in its own right, since the NAACP joined the case gets mentioned in coverage without much sense of what it actually adds beyond an attorney's own firm. The NAACP's legal involvement in a case typically brings organizational infrastructure a single attorney's office doesn't have on its own, a national network capable of coordinating public pressure across multiple states and media markets simultaneously, long-standing relationships with civil rights divisions inside state and federal government, and an institutional history, going back over a century, of tracking and litigating exactly the kind of pattern Bryant's sermon invoked. Unequal urgency in how missing or deceased Black Americans' cases get handled relative to comparable cases involving white victims. Their involvement doesn't change the underlying facts of what happened to Nolan on Horn Island. It does mean the case now sits inside a considerably larger institutional apparatus than a single family and a single retained attorney, which is likely to sustain public attention on this case for considerably longer than it would otherwise have lasted, regardless of what the grand jury ultimately decides. That detail matters, because one of the loudest criticisms circulating about this case is the claim, made by several commentators, that hiring a nationally known civil rights attorney for a case with no publicly established racial component is itself suspicious, the implication being that a family wouldn't reach for that kind of representation unless they were building toward a race-based narrative deliberately, for financial reasons. We want to slow down on that claim because it deserves real scrutiny in both directions rather than being accepted or dismissed reflexively. On one hand, it is true that Crump's practice is closely associated with cases involving allegations of racial injustice, and it is fair, legitimate commentary to note that his involvement in a case tends to shape how that case gets covered nationally, given his public profile and his history. On the other hand, families in wrongful death situations reach for the most prominent, resourced legal representation they can access for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with racial narrative building, resources, investigative capacity, name recognition that guarantees a case doesn't quietly disappear, and simple personal instinct in an overwhelming moment, which is exactly the explanation Christine Wells GoFundMe herself has given. Assuming the family's motive was calculated financial or racial strategy, rather than what the family has actually stated, that they wanted serious legal help and didn't know where else, in their moment of crisis, to turn, is itself an assumption, not a documented fact. Both explanations remain possible. Neither one has been proven from the outside. Before we get to that, let's slow down on the single most concrete, most forensically important development in this entire case: what actually happened with the two autopsies, and why both of them, despite real effort and real expertise behind each, came back listed as undetermined. The official autopsy was performed by the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office on July 7th, the day after Nolan's body was recovered. Its full findings have not been made public. District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath announced on July 23rd that those results would remain sealed, to be presented first to a grand jury rather than released to the public or the family's own legal team ahead of that process. That decision, on its own, is a fairly ordinary prosecutorial choice in a death investigation that might still result in charges. Releasing forensic findings prematurely can compromise a case, taint a jury pool, or tip off exactly the kind of information investigators sometimes need to keep close during witness interviews. It is also, understandably, exactly the kind of decision that reads as suspicious stonewalling to a family already distrustful of the process, even when it isn't. That distrust is a large part of why the family commissioned a second, independent autopsy, performed by Dr. Roger A. Mitchell, Jr., president of Howard University Hospital and a respected forensic pathologist with no professional ties to Mississippi law enforcement, funded through Colin Kaepernick's initiative. It's worth explaining why families in high-profile cases like this one so often reach for a specific kind of independent examiner rather than simply any available private pathologist. Dr. Mitchell's specific credentials matter here. A sitting hospital president and academic forensic pathologist carries a level of institutional standing that makes his findings considerably harder to dismiss as a hired gun's conclusions, precisely the kind of credibility a family in an adversarial, high-scrutiny situation needs if they intend for a second opinion to actually shift public or legal understanding of a case, rather than simply be waved away as bought testimony. That doesn't mean his findings are automatically more correct than the state's. Forensic pathology is a real science with real limits regardless of who's performing it, as his own inconclusive results here demonstrate. It does mean the family made a deliberate, considered choice about whose name would be attached to their side of this dispute, rather than reaching for the fastest or cheapest available option. Dr. Mitchell's findings, made public on July 22, found no bone fractures and no deep tissue injuries on Nolan's body. But he also noted an area of unexplained red discoloration on the back of Nolan's skull and, critically, reported that he could not determine whether water had entered Nolan's lungs or whether there was any injury to his neck because the state medical examiner's office had already removed and retained those specific structures during its own earlier autopsy. Without lungs to examine for drowning and without neck tissue to examine for possible strangulation or other injury, an independent pathologist doing a second, later autopsy is working with real, physical gaps in the body itself, gaps created by the ordinary, standard procedure of the first autopsy, not necessarily by anything improper. Dr. Mitchell's own conclusion, given those constraints, was that he could not determine a manner of death and could not rule out non-accidental factors. It's worth being precise about what undetermined, from two separate medical examiners using two separate methodologies, actually tells us. It does not mean foul play is confirmed. It does not mean an accidental drowning is confirmed. It means, quite literally, that the physical evidence available to two credentialed, independent forensic pathologists was not sufficient on its own to answer the question either way, a genuinely unsatisfying answer for everyone involved, and also, as far as the actual science goes, the most honest one currently available. Anyone online stating with confidence that this case is obviously a homicide or obviously a simple drowning is going well beyond what either autopsy, official or independent, has actually been able to establish. Now, let's talk about the piece of this case that most clearly shows how quickly a genuine, felt urgency for the truth can outrun the actual, verified facts, the video and the photograph. At some point during this case's escalation, Ben Crump's team circulated a video described as capturing an argument on the island in which a voice can be heard shouting, "Give me my freaking phone. What are you freaking doing?" Presented publicly in a way that invited viewers to wonder whether it captured Nolan himself, in distress, shortly before his death. It was an enormously powerful piece of content, exactly the kind of detail built to spread. It was also, according to a young man named Traciston Shepard who came forward afterward, not Nolan at all. Shepard stated the voice was his own, recorded during a separate, unrelated argument with another man over Shepard's girlfriend. An account independent reporting was able to corroborate directly with Shepard's girlfriend and his uncle. A second piece of circulated material, a photograph of Nolan at a pool party, presented as possible evidence that he'd survived and returned to the mainland on July 5th, only to disappear and die afterward, was, according to that same corroborated account, actually taken on June 27th, more than a week before the 4th of July trip, at an entirely separate gathering. There's one more genuinely unsettling detail in this case worth explaining carefully, because it's exactly the kind of fact that sounds far more sinister stripped of context than it turns out to be once you have it. Nolan left his cell phone behind on the boat that day, and it was later recovered on the mainland rather than with him. His aunt has publicly noted that there's no Snapchat activity from Nolan on July 4th, which struck her as unusual given how active he typically was on social media. Taken alone, A missing teenager who left his phone behind and generated no digital trail on the day he disappeared sounds like exactly the kind of detailed true crime coverage builds an entire episode around. Shepard's account, corroborated independently, offers a much more mundane explanation. Leaving phones behind during island gatherings like this one is common practice, specifically because saltwater and boats are a fast way to ruin a phone, and because a big group of friends spending the day together doesn't generate the same need to document everything the way a solo outing might. That explanation doesn't prove anything definitively about what happened to Nolan afterward. It does mean this specific detail, the missing phone, the quiet Snapchat, carries less evidentiary weight on its own than it might initially seem to, once you understand it in the context of how a lot of ordinary teenagers actually behave at exactly this kind of gathering. We want to be very clear about what this does and doesn't tell us. It is not proof that Crump, or the family, or anyone circulating this material acted in bad faith. Powerful, viral evidence in a fast-moving case gets misattributed constantly, sometimes through nothing more sinister than a well-meaning person seeing what they're primed to see in an ambiguous clip, and Crump's team has not, as far as public reporting shows, been shown to have known these were misattributed at the time they were shared. What it does tell you, concretely, is that at least two separate, specific, dramatic pieces of evidence that shaped the public's understanding of this case for a real stretch of time turned out, on closer examination, to be unconnected to Nolan Wells at all. That's a genuinely important data point for calibrating how much confidence to place in any other piece of viral evidence still circulating about this case that hasn't yet been checked as carefully as these two happen to be. There's one more detail in this case that deserves far more attention than it's generally gotten, because it complicates the institutional indifference framing in a way almost nobody discussing this case seems to have fully reckoned with. Ashley Cole, Warren Hudson's stepmother, the woman targeted by enough threats that a man in Sacramento was arrested on federal charges for allegedly sending them, is, according to public reporting, a sitting judge. Not simply a private citizen caught in the crossfire of a viral case, but an actual member of the judiciary in the same state where this investigation, this grand jury process, and any eventual prosecution are unfolding. Whatever her specific role, if any, in her stepson's situation, her position adds a layer of institutional weight to this story that a simple grieving family versus indifferent local system framing doesn't capture, because one of the private citizens absorbing threats and harassment in this case is, herself, part of the very justice system Bryant and others have criticized as indifferent. That doesn't resolve any of the case's central questions. It does mean the institutional map here is more tangled than the cleanest version of either side's narrative allows for. It's worth explaining briefly why the boys' families chose GiveSendGo specifically rather than GoFundMe, since the choice of platform is not neutral in the way it might first appear. GiveSendGo has built its reputation over the past several years as a fundraising platform more permissive of politically and culturally polarizing campaigns than GoFundMe, which has periodically removed or restricted fundraisers it judged to violate its content policies, including some tied to controversial causes. A family in this situation choosing GiveSendGo over GoFundMe is, in effect, choosing a platform less likely to face pressure to remove or restrict their campaign regardless of how contentious the underlying case becomes. A practical, strategic decision, not necessarily an ideological statement in itself. Though it's also not a coincidence given how polarized this specific case had already become by the time that fundraiser launched. It's also worth pointing out a detail that adds a striking symmetry to the money question we discussed earlier. Warren Hudson, Jax Patalo, and Morgan Seymour launched their own fundraiser on that platform, reportedly raising more than $90,000 by early August to help cover their own legal costs. That means, as of this video, there are two separate, viral, publicly scrutinized fundraisers connected to this single case, one tied to Nolan's family, one tied to the three young men defending their names, and the same public that spent weeks asking pointed questions about how the Wells family's GoFundMe money was being used has, by and large, not applied anything like that same scrutiny to the boys' fundraiser. That's worth sitting with, not necessarily as evidence that either fundraiser is being misused, but as a demonstration of exactly the kind of asymmetric attention this video has been describing throughout, which financial question gets asked, and how loudly, often depends far more on which side of a case's narrative a viewer has already picked than on any actual, even-handed standard for scrutinizing money raised around a tragedy. This brings us to the moment that arguably did more to nationalize this case than anything else that's happened since: the sermon delivered by Pastor Jamal Bryant, with the family reportedly seated in the front row of his church. Bryant preached on the biblical account of Cain and Abel, the story of the first murder in Genesis, and God's question to Cain, "Where is your brother?" declaring that this moment could end a cycle of vicious, violent racism, and directly calling on Mississippi's governor, Tate Reeves, to personally press the state's judges on the case, saying the state didn't have decades to solve it. In an earlier appearance, Bryant and others around the family also invoked a hypothetical in which the racial roles were reversed, suggesting that if a black teenager had been the one left behind by a group of white friends who then went missing, an arrest would already have happened. He described the case using language tied to a specific historical and cultural framework around how black families are treated by the justice system relative to white families, and he directly criticized what he characterized as institutional indifference in Mississippi toward a grieving black mother. That framing did two things simultaneously, and it's worth naming both because they cut in opposite directions. On one hand, Bryant's underlying point, that outcomes in the American justice system have not historically been distributed equally across race, and that families of color raising the alarm about a missing or deceased loved one have, in numerous well-documented cases across this country's history, been treated with less urgency than white families in comparable circumstances, reflects a genuinely documented pattern that exists independent of this specific case, and it is not an unreasonable instinct for a pastor speaking to a grieving congregation to invoke that broader context. It's worth being specific, briefly, about what that documented history actually consists of, because invoking Mississippi's history without any detail can come across as an applause line rather than a substantive point. Mississippi's 20th century record includes well-documented cases of law enforcement failing to seriously investigate or actively obstructing investigations into violence against black residents, a pattern extensively documented by historians, by the state's own later reconciliation efforts, and by federal civil rights prosecutions brought decades after the fact once state-level investigations had stalled or been abandoned entirely. That history is real, well-established, and not seriously disputed by credible historians across the political spectrum. It is also specifically history, meaning it describes patterns in past decades, under different leadership, different oversight, and a different legal and cultural landscape than exists in Jackson County today. Citing that history to explain why families and communities carry real, earned distrust of institutional promises is entirely reasonable. Citing it as direct, specific proof of what is or isn't happening inside this particular investigation, run by particular people, under today's legal standards, is a different and considerably weaker claim, and it's worth being able to tell the two apart. On the other hand, applying that general historical pattern to this specific case, as though it were already a proven fact of what happened to Nolan, asserting as a matter of certainty that race explains why an arrest hasn't been made, goes well beyond what the public record in this specific case currently shows. As of this video, no charges have been filed against anyone. There's no confirmed cause of death establishing a homicide rather than an accidental drowning, and there is no public evidence establishing that race specifically, rather than the ordinary pace of a death investigation involving toxicology results and a large number of witnesses, explains why this case hasn't concluded. Both of those things, a legitimate broader historical pattern and an unproven specific application of it to this exact case, can be true and separate at the same time, and a lot of the online fighting over this case comes from people collapsing them into one argument when they're actually two different claims requiring two different kinds of evidence. Here's a detail worth sitting with because it complicates the two sides framing this entire online argument keeps defaulting to some of Nolan's own friends, including, according to reporting on this case, friends who are themselves black or biracial, have publicly pushed back on the idea that this case needs to be understood through a racial lens at all, arguing the case is being racialized in ways that don't reflect what they actually witnessed or believe happened that day. That matters because it means the disagreement over how to understand this case isn't simply black commentators on one side and white commentators on the other, the way cable news-style coverage often flattens it. It's a disagreement that runs through Nolan's own friend group and community, not just through outside pundits who never met him. The response to Bryant's sermon, and to related commentary from Reverend Al Sharpton, was immediate and forceful from a different corner of the media landscape. Brandon Tatum, a former Tucson police officer who now hosts The Officer Tatum Show, became one of the most visible voices pushing back on the racial framing, stating publicly and repeatedly that he did not believe race was a factor in Nolan's death, arguing that the gathering that day included roughly 300 people rather than an isolated encounter between a small number of teenagers of different races, and that no comparable case in recent Mississippi history supports the specific claim. That a reversed racial scenario would have produced a different, faster law enforcement response. Tatum went on to host Warren Hudson, Jax Patalo, and Morgan Seymour directly on his program, an appearance that drew its own wave of criticism, including from sports journalist Jemele Hill, who argued the optics of the three friends telling their story on a sympathetic platform without equivalent scrutiny were themselves troubling. That pushback, too, deserves to be evaluated on its own terms rather than dismissed simply because of who's making it. The underlying claim that this specific gathering involved a large, diffuse group rather than a small, isolated one appears to be something both sides of this dispute actually agree on, even as they disagree sharply about what that agreed-upon fact means for how the case should be understood. What's genuinely hard to escape, watching this dispute unfold, is how quickly a set of legitimate, separate questions. Was Nolan's death an accident? Did anyone fail to help him when they could have? Is the investigation moving with appropriate urgency? Is race playing any role in how it's being handled? Collapsed into a single, undifferentiated shouting match where every commentator on every side treats their own certainty as self-evident. Genuine, good faith versions of nearly every position in this dispute exist. So do bad faith versions on every side, using this specific tragedy as raw material for a broader ideological fight that existed long before Nolan Wells died and will exist long after this case is resolved one way or another. Now, let's get into the part of the story that has produced the most concrete, documentable consequence so far: the defamation lawsuit threat aimed at Reverend Al Sharpton. According to a letter attributed to attorneys representing Warren Hudson, Jax Patalo, and Morgan Seymour, a document reportedly 19 pages long, portions of which have circulated publicly through independent reporting, the three young men are threatening to sue Sharpton for defamation over specific public statements he's made connecting them to Nolan's death. The letter reportedly demands a public apology, a written retraction of specific disputed statements, deletion or correction of those statements, and preservation of related evidence in anticipation of litigation. The substance of the dispute, according to that letter, centers on Nolan's cell phone. The letter reportedly disputes claims, attributed to Sharpton, suggesting that the three young men possessed, accessed, or erased data from Nolan's phone, and disputes an implication that they lied about whether they had the phone or Nolan's keys. The boys' attorneys reportedly state, directly and specifically, that none of the three ever possessed, accessed, breached, erased, or tampered with Nolan's phone, that they did not lie about the phone or the keys, and that they did, in fact, contact Nolan's family, the Coast Guard, and law enforcement that night, consistent with the phone call timeline described earlier in this video. The letter also reportedly disputes a characterization suggesting the group was small and isolated, restating instead that a very large number of people, reportedly cited in some versions of this account as roughly 2,000, were present on the island that day, and that at no point were the three young men alone with Nolan. We want to be precise about what this lawsuit threat actually establishes, and what it doesn't. A demand letter threatening defamation litigation is not a court filing, and it is not a judgment. It is one side's opening legal position, asserting facts that side believes it can prove, exactly the same category of document, procedurally speaking, as the prosecutor's bail memorandum in a criminal case, just aimed in a civil rather than criminal direction. It tells you what Warren Hudson, Jax Patalo, and Morgan Seymour's legal team is prepared to formally allege and fight for. It does not, by itself, prove that Sharpton's original statements were false, and it does not resolve what actually happened to Nolan. What it does establish, concretely, is that three specific young men have now taken the extraordinary step of threatening one of the country's most prominent civil rights figures with formal litigation, a serious, expensive, high-risk move for anyone, let alone a group of teenagers, which is itself a meaningful signal about how strongly they and their legal counsel believe their account of that night will hold up under scrutiny. It's worth explaining, in plain terms, what a defamation claim like this one would actually have to prove, because the bar is higher than a lot of online commentary about suing for defamation tends to suggest. In general, American defamation law requires a plaintiff to show that a defendant made a false statement of fact, not opinion, about them, that the statement was communicated to others, that it caused reputational harm, and, critically, that the defendant acted with at least a meaningful degree of fault in how they handled the truth of what they said. For claims involving public figures, courts generally apply what's called the actual malice standard, meaning the plaintiff has to show the speaker knew a statement was false or acted with reckless disregard for whether it was true, a considerably higher bar than simply being wrong. Warren Hudson, Jack Spatalo, and Morgan Seymour, as private individuals who did not seek out public attention before this case, would very likely not be treated as public figures for defamation purposes, even though their names have since become widely known through this controversy. Courts generally distinguish between people who voluntarily inject themselves into public controversy and people who become the subject of public attention involuntarily, through no action of their own, and the latter category typically retains the lower, more plaintiff-friendly standard of ordinary negligence rather than actual malice. That legal distinction is a meaningful part of why this lawsuit thread is being taken seriously rather than dismissed as an empty gesture. If their attorneys can show that specific factual claims made about the phone, the keys, or their whereabouts were false and communicated carelessly or worse, the private figure standard makes a successful claim considerably more achievable than it would be against, say, a claim made about a sitting public official. None of this tells us whether Sharpton's specific statements will ultimately be found to cross that line. That would require a court to actually weigh the exact words used, the context they were said in, and whatever evidence each side eventually presents. But it does explain why just asking questions is not, on its own, a defense that automatically protects a speaker from a defamation claim. If a statement crosses from raising an open question into asserting a specific false fact, for instance, stating as established fact that specific named individuals erase specific data from a specific phone, rather than framing it as an open question the investigation should resolve. That distinction is exactly the kind of thing a defamation case turns on, and it's exactly the distinction the boy's attorney's letter appears to be built around. Before we go further, it's worth pausing on the estate filing mentioned in some of the commentary around this case, the reported filing of paperwork to open an estate in Nolan's name around the time of his funeral. This detail has been cited by some commentators as evidence that the family is preparing a wrongful death lawsuit, timed suspiciously close to the funeral itself. It's worth explaining what opening an estate actually means procedurally, because the timing, while emotionally jarring to hear described that way, is not unusual or improper in a legal sense. When someone dies, particularly a minor or young adult without a will, any legal claims connected to their death, including a wrongful death claim, if the family chooses to pursue one, generally have to be brought on behalf of the deceased person's estate, which requires that an estate first be formally opened in probate court, with an administrator appointed to act on the estate's behalf. This is a standard, procedural first step that families in wrongful death situations are frequently advised to take early, specifically because it can take time to process and because it preserves the family's legal options while other facts, like a final cause of death or an ongoing criminal investigation, are still being established. Opening an estate is not itself proof of a lawsuit's existence, nor is it proof of anyone's specific financial motive. It is closer to buying an insurance policy on a legal option a family may or may not ultimately use, and treating it as a smoking gun for premeditated financial opportunism skips past a much more mundane, procedural explanation that fits the same facts just as well. There's a practical complication sitting underneath any eventual trial in this case that rarely gets discussed in commentary, and it's worth explaining because the sheer scale of publicity this case has generated creates a genuine legal problem for whoever eventually has to seat a jury. Finding 12 people in the relevant jurisdiction who haven't already formed a strong opinion about it. Courts have a specific mechanism for exactly this problem, called a change of venue, which allows a trial to be moved to a different county or district when pretrial publicity has been so extensive and so one-sided that seating an impartial local jury becomes genuinely difficult. Whether any eventual prosecution connected to this case would actually require a venue change is impossible to know this far ahead of an indictment, let alone a trial. But given how far beyond Mississippi's borders this case has already traveled, with national pastors, national civil rights attorneys, and national commentary channels all shaping public perception of it for months before any trial date exists, it's a genuinely live question defense attorneys on any side of this case would be right to raise if and when it actually reaches that stage. If a wrongful death suit is eventually filed here, it's worth understanding, in general terms, what that process actually involves and what it doesn't. A wrongful death claim allows a deceased person's estate or surviving family to seek civil damages from a party the family believes bears legal responsibility for the death through negligence, recklessness, or intentional harm, separate and apart from any criminal charges that may or may not ever be filed against anyone. It operates under a lower burden of proof than a criminal case. A plaintiff generally has to show liability by a preponderance of the evidence, meaning more likely than not, rather than the criminal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. This is exactly why it's legally possible, in American law, for someone to be found civilly liable for a death in a wrongful death suit even in a case where no criminal charges are ever filed, or where a criminal case results in an acquittal. The two systems ask different questions, using different evidentiary standards, and one outcome does not automatically determine the other. Whether the Wells family ultimately pursues a wrongful death claim against anyone connected to this case, and against whom specifically, remains, as of this video, entirely speculative. Nothing public confirms who, if anyone, such a suit would eventually name as a defendant. Let's talk, in general terms, about what happens to private individuals, people who never sought public attention and have no public relations infrastructure to manage it, when they become the subject of a viral true crime-adjacent controversy like this one, because it's a pattern that shows up again and again in cases like this, independent of the specific facts of any one case. Once a name, a face, and an accusation start circulating widely online, an enormous amount of real-world consequence can follow before any formal legal process has reached a conclusion, sometimes before it's even meaningfully begun. According to accounts referenced in commentary on this case, multiple people connected to Warren Hudson, Jack Spatalo, and Morgan Seymour's side of the story, a stepmother, individuals involved in the investigation, even reportedly a nail technician connected to one of the families entirely incidentally, have received threats serious enough that several individuals have reportedly been arrested for making them. Reports also describe threats directed at Warren's father. Simultaneously, Christine Wells Wansley has described experiencing what she's characterized as bullying and harassment connected to her handling of this case, along with a formal complaint filed against her professional nursing license. Both of these things, threats against the boys' families and hostility directed at Nolan's mother, are being reported as real, and there is no reason from the outside to assume one side's harassment is more legitimate a grievance than the other's. People on every side of the story, including people with no direct connection to whatever actually happened to Nolan, are currently living with real, documented consequences from a case that has not reached any legal resolution at all. This is worth sitting with directly, because it's easy to watch commentary like the videos the story is drawn from and experience it as pure entertainment, a dramatic, fast-moving conflict with clear heroes and villains, depending on which channel you're watching. But underneath the commentary are real people, a set of teenagers whose lives, according to their own attorneys, have been genuinely altered by public accusation before any court has weighed a single piece of evidence, a mother managing grief in the most public, most scrutinized way imaginable, and a wider circle of family members, friends, and bystanders absorbing consequences, job threats, harassment, fear, for a case most of them had no direct hand in creating. Before we go further, I want to take a second and talk to you directly because I think it matters for a case like this one specifically. Cases like Nolan Wells spread the way they do because they're built for spreading. A missing teenager, a viral fundraiser, a civil rights figure, a defamation threat, a pastor's sermon, a talk show pushback. Every single piece of it is engineered, whether anyone intended it that way or not, to generate outrage, clicks, and quick, confident takes from people who watched one 90-second clip and decided they already understood the whole story. What almost nobody is doing, in the flood of commentary this case has generated, is actually laying out the documented timeline, the actual legal mechanics of a defamation threat, the actual rules governing a GoFundMe, and the actual, still unresolved status of the underlying investigation, side by side, without picking a side before the facts are actually in. That's what we've tried to do in this video, and it's the entire reason this channel exists. Not to hand you a verdict, but to hand you the actual shape of a story most coverage flattens into a headline. If that's the kind of coverage you want more of, take 2 seconds and subscribe before you keep watching, because it's genuinely the only thing that tells us to keep making videos like this one instead of chasing whatever's trending for a single news cycle and disappearing. It helps more than you'd expect, and it costs you nothing. Okay, back to the case. Let's talk about why an investigation into a death like this one, on open water, at a large, loosely organized gathering of roughly 300 people cycling on and off different boats over the course of a day, typically takes as long as it does, because a lot of the frustration driving this case's online life comes from an expectation that answers should arrive faster than water death investigations of this scale realistically allow. Drowning investigations, even ones without any suspicion of foul play attached, generally require toxicology and forensic results that can take weeks to come back from a state lab depending on caseload. In this case, roughly 3.5 weeks passed between Nolan's death and the completion of the official autopsy. They require reconciling potentially dozens of independent, sometimes contradictory witness accounts. Investigators here interviewed roughly 60 people, from people who were on different boats, at different distances, at different times of day, some of whom had been drinking, all of whom are being asked to accurately reconstruct a chaotic, informal gathering rather than a controlled scene. They require establishing a timeline precise enough to determine not just that someone died, but roughly when, and whether the interval between last known contact and discovery is consistent with an accidental drowning or raises questions that warrant closer scrutiny. None of that happens on the timeline social media operates on. A case that feels, to an online audience 7 weeks in, like it's taking suspiciously long, may in fact be moving at an entirely ordinary pace for the actual forensic and investigative work involved. And the fact that a grand jury process is now actively underway suggests investigators are working through what, if anything, this case will formally become, not stalling. It's also worth naming, honestly, the same amateur sleuth ecosystem that tends to form around any case with this much viral potential, a pattern this channel has discussed in other cases, and one that applies just as directly here. Within days of Nolan's death becoming public, and especially once the GoFundMe total and the racial framing entered the conversation, forums, comment sections, and competing commentary channels filled with confident, detailed theories about exactly what happened on that island, exactly who's lying, and exactly what motive is driving each side, sometimes built on nothing sturdier than a screenshot, a partial timeline, and a strong prior belief about how a case like this usually goes. Some of that attention has real value. It's part of why a defamation letter exists, why a phone call timeline is public at all, why this case hasn't simply faded from view the way most missing person stories eventually do. But a great deal of it also hardens into certainty long before the actual investigative record has been made public, and once a theory takes hold, the family is obviously running a scheme, or, just as prematurely, these boys obviously know exactly what happened. It becomes very difficult to dislodge, regardless of what an eventual investigation, or an eventual civil trial, actually reveals. Our goal in this video isn't to hand you a replacement certainty to hold instead of either of those. It's to slow that process down, the same way we'd want it slowed down if it were happening to someone we knew. Here's the tension this entire case keeps circling back to, and it's worth stating plainly rather than letting it stay implicit. A mother is allowed to be devastated, to demand answers, to distrust an institutional process that has historically failed families who look like hers, and to still, simultaneously, be wrong about specific facts if the eventual record shows she was wrong about them. 3 teenagers are allowed to be completely innocent of any wrongdoing connected to Nolan's death, to have done everything right that night, called the mother, called the Coast Guard, called the sheriff, and to still, simultaneously, be the subject of a family's legitimate, unresolved grief and suspicion, because grief doesn't wait for a completed investigation to demand somewhere to land. Neither of those realities cancels the other out. A family's pain being real does not make every specific claim built on top of that pain accurate. Three young men's account of that night being accurate, if it turns out to be, does not make the family's anguish or their demand for real answers illegitimate. Holding both of those things at once is uncomfortable, and it is also the only honest way to actually sit with a case this unresolved. It's worth being honest, too, about our own responsibility in telling a story like this one, because a channel covering a case this racially and emotionally charged has an obligation to show, not just claim, what careful coverage actually looks like. Responsible coverage of a case like this means naming clearly that an 18-year-old is dead and that his family's grief is real and deserves respect, regardless of how any of the surrounding controversy resolves. It means being precise about what's actually documented, a phone call timeline, a GoFundMe total, a defamation demand letter, rather than repeating unverified personal attacks on people on any side of the story, family members and accused teenagers alike. It means naming genuine uncertainty as uncertainty, rather than picking whichever narrative performs better and presenting it as settled. And it means remembering that behind every name in the story, Nolan, Christine, Warren, Jax, Morgan, and everyone connected to them who's been pulled into this without asking to be, are real people whose lives continue, in real and difficult ways, long after a given video's upload date. Let's slow down further on the search and rescue side of this case, because a detail that keeps surfacing in the phone call timeline, Warren's contact with the Coast Guard that night, only really means something once you understand how a maritime search actually works and how different it is from the way a missing person case unfolds on land. When someone goes missing on open water, the Coast Guard's response is governed by a well-established set of protocols built around something called a search and rescue case, and the moment a report comes in, personnel begin what's known as a datum calculation, an estimate of where a person or vessel is most likely to be, built from last known position, water currents, wind, and elapsed time. That estimate changes and generally expands with every hour that passes, because currents move a person in the water considerably further than most people intuitively expect. This is part of why the exact minute-by-minute timeline of when Warren called, when the Coast Guard was first notified, and when local law enforcement got involved matters so much to how this case gets evaluated after the fact. A search that begins promptly, even by 15 or 20 minutes, can cover a meaningfully smaller, more accurate search area than one that begins after unnecessary delay. If the phone call timeline reported publicly is accurate, contact with the Coast Guard came within roughly 6 minutes of the first call to Nolan's mother, which is a notably fast interval for a group of teenagers realizing a friend hasn't come back from the water. Whether that timeline holds up under whatever official review has or hasn't happened is a separate question from whether it's fast in the abstract, but taken at face value, it does not describe a group of people who sat on the information, which is part of why the boys' attorneys have leaned on it so heavily in their public defense. It's also worth understanding, in general terms, why an initial search and rescue effort transitioning into what's often internally called a recovery operation, searching for a body rather than a living person, doesn't by itself imply anything sinister happened. Survival time in open water depends heavily on water temperature, a person's physical condition, whether they were wearing a flotation device, and how much time elapsed before a search began. Even in relatively mild coastal water, prolonged immersion can become fatal within a period measured in hours, not days. A case transitioning from an active rescue to a body recovery, sometimes within the same night or the following day, is a devastating but unfortunately common outcome in coastal drowning cases generally, entirely independent of whether anyone did anything wrong. It's worth noting, too, who actually found Nolan's body, because the detail is a small but genuinely meaningful piece of the jurisdictional puzzle this case sits inside. A United States Park Service ranger, not a county deputy or a Coast Guard crew member, made the discovery. That's because Horn Island itself sits inside the Gulf Islands National Seashore, a federally managed protected area, meaning the ground where Nolan's body was found is technically federal land, even though the surrounding investigation is being run primarily by county and state authorities. That overlapping jurisdiction is exactly why the FBI's later involvement, discussed earlier in this video, was accurately described by Sheriff Ledbetter as routine rather than exceptional. Federal involvement in a death investigation that begins on federally managed land is a structural feature of where this happened, not a signal that federal authorities suspect a federal crime occurred. Let's also walk through, in plain terms, what a Mississippi grand jury process actually looks like, because this case has been described in commentary as moving toward a grand jury, and it's worth being precise about what that means procedurally, the same way we'd want that explained in any case we cover. Like most states, Mississippi requires that certain categories of serious charges, generally felony-level offenses, be presented to a grand jury before formal prosecution can proceed, rather than allowing a prosecutor to file those charges unilaterally. A grand jury in this context is a panel of local citizens who hear evidence presented exclusively by the prosecution, in a closed proceeding without a defense attorney cross-examining witnesses, and who are asked a considerably narrower question than a trial jury, not whether someone is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but simply whether probable cause exists to believe a crime occurred and that a specific person likely committed it. The fact that a grand jury process has reportedly been invoked or anticipated in coverage of this case does not, on its own, tell us whether charges will ultimately be sought against anyone at all. Prosecutors sometimes present a case to a grand jury specifically to formally close out an investigation with a declination, not only to seek an indictment. Reaching a grand jury stage is a procedural milestone, not a preview of its outcome, and it's worth resisting the temptation, which a lot of commentary on this case has not resisted, to treat grand jury as a phrase that by itself confirms someone's guilt is imminent. In this specific case, District Attorney Angel Myers-McElrath has stated directly that the sealed autopsy findings will go to a grand jury before any public release, meaning the public may not learn the actual, official cause and manner of Nolan's death until that grand jury has already met, reviewed the evidence, and reached its own decision about probable cause. It's also worth explaining what the Congressional Black Caucus's request to the Department of Justice, made in August, would actually mean if it's granted, since calling for a federal investigation gets thrown around in coverage of high-profile cases without much explanation of what it involves procedurally. The DOJ Civil Rights Division has the authority to open its own independent review of a local investigation when there's a credible concern about whether a case is being handled properly, including whether racial bias may be affecting how thoroughly or how quickly it's pursued. A DOJ review, if one is opened, doesn't replace the local investigation or the state's own grand jury process. It runs alongside them, with federal investigators examining the same underlying facts through their own separate lens, and it can, if it finds a basis to, result in independent federal charges under civil rights statutes, entirely apart from whatever the state ultimately does. Whether the DOJ actually opens such a review here as of this video is not something that's been publicly confirmed one way or the other. The Congressional Black Caucus's letter is a request, not a guarantee that one will happen. Let's turn to Reverend Al Sharpton's specific role in this story a bit more directly, because his involvement carries its own history worth understanding in general terms, separate from whatever the facts of this particular case turn out to be. Sharpton has, across several decades of public life, positioned himself as an advocate who inserts national attention into local cases involving Black families and allegations of unequal treatment by law enforcement or the broader justice system, a role that has, in numerous well-documented instances across his career, brought overdue national scrutiny to cases that local authorities were credibly accused of mishandling or slow-walking. That track record is real, and it's part of why families in situations like the Wells families often welcome his involvement. It comes with genuine visibility and genuine institutional pressure that an ordinary local case rarely receives on its own. It's also true, and has been noted by critics across the political spectrum for just as long, that inserting a high public profile into a case before its facts are fully established carries its own risk. Once a nationally known figure stakes a public position on what happened in a specific case, walking that position back, if the facts eventually point elsewhere, becomes reputationally costly in a way that discourages it, structurally, regardless of the individual's intentions. Both of those things, a real history of drawing needed attention to genuinely mishandled cases and a real risk of locking in a public position before the facts are settled, describe the same category of public figure, and neither one on its own tells you which pattern is playing out in this specific case. It's worth noting that this is not the first time a public figure with this specific profile, a national civil rights advocate stepping into a local case, has faced a legal challenge over statements made in the heat of exactly this kind of controversy, and that broader pattern is itself worth understanding in general terms. Advocates who regularly speak publicly about contested, fast-moving cases accept, as a structural feature of that role, a meaningfully higher risk of facing exactly this kind of legal challenge than someone who never comments publicly on unresolved cases at all. The more often you speak with confidence about live, disputed situations, the more chances exist for a specific sentence to eventually be challenged as having crossed the line between commentary and factual assertion. That's not a criticism unique to Sharpton, or to advocates who lean in any particular political direction. It's simply the occupational hazard that comes with choosing to be a prominent public voice on cases like this one, rather than staying silent until the facts are fully settled. The same hazard, worth repeating, applies just as fully to Brandon Tatum, to Jamal Bryant, and to every other commentator this video has named. Anyone who chooses to speak with public confidence about a genuinely unresolved case accepts the risk that some of what they said will look wrong in hindsight, once the facts this video keeps insisting nobody outside the investigation actually has yet finally become public. The same kind of scrutiny is worth applying, in fairness, to the commentary pushing back against Sharpton and Bryant, because that side of this dispute carries its own set of incentives too. Commentary channels built around pushing back on racially framed narratives generate significant engagement precisely by being the voice of confident, aggressive rebuttal, declaring, for instance, 0% chance that specific named individuals did anything wrong, a level of certainty that, just like the certainty on the other side of this dispute, exceeds what the public record currently supports either way. A statement that no wrongdoing occurred, stated with total confidence before an investigation concludes, is exactly as far ahead of the actual evidence as a statement that wrongdoing definitely did occur. We've said this about the accusatory side of this dispute already, and it's worth saying with equal force about the exculpatory side. Confidence is not evidence, no matter which direction it's pointed in, and no matter how understandable the underlying instinct, defending teenagers who say they've done nothing wrong, actually is. Let's talk in general terms about how a professional complaint against a nurse's license, like the one reportedly filed against Christine Wells Wansley, actually works, because it's another detail that's been treated in commentary as more conclusive than the underlying process typically allows. In most states, a complaint against a licensed nurse triggers a formal review by the relevant state nursing board, a process that can take anywhere from weeks to many months, and the mere existence of a filed complaint does not constitute a finding of wrongdoing. Most complaints filed against licensed professionals across nearly every regulated profession do not result in any disciplinary action once reviewed, precisely because filing a complaint requires no evidentiary threshold beyond a person's willingness to submit one. A single complaint, without more, tells you that someone was upset enough to file it. It does not tell you whether a licensing board found any merit in it, and treating an unresolved complaint as equivalent to a finding of professional misconduct, in either direction, whether used to attack Christine Wells Wansley or, hypothetically, anyone else in this story, skips past the actual process a licensing board exists to conduct. It's worth returning one more time to the specific young woman Nolan reportedly stayed behind with, because she is one of the very few people in this entire story who has, as far as public reporting shows, not been named, has not given a televised interview, and has not become a combatant in the online arguments surrounding this case. And it's worth asking why that restraint has held for her specifically when it hasn't held for almost anyone else pulled into this story. It may simply be that she has chosen privacy, and that choice deserves the same respect this video is extending to every other private individual named in it. It may also be that whatever she experienced or witnessed that evening sits closer to the actual center of what happened than nearly anything else discussed publicly so far, and if that's true, it's a reminder that the loudest, most public voices in a case like this are not necessarily the ones holding the most important information. Cases like this one are frequently, in the end, resolved less by the volume of public argument than by a handful of quiet witnesses nobody was shouting about at the time. Let's take a moment to compare this case, in general terms, to the broader pattern of high-profile disappearance and death cases that generate this kind of intense national attention. Because Nolan Wells' case did not invent this dynamic, it's stepping into a well-worn media pattern that plays out with remarkable consistency across cases, with very different underlying facts. A young person dies or disappears under circumstances involving a group of peers. A grieving family, desperate for answers and often distrustful of a local investigation's pace, seeks outside help, legal, media, or both. National figures and commentary channels, sensing an audience, arrive within days, often before local investigators have even completed a first-pass timeline. A viral fundraiser generates far more money than the family may have anticipated, which then becomes its own subplot, its own controversy, sometimes outlasting public interest in the original tragedy itself. And throughout all of it, the peers connected to the missing or deceased person, rarely charged with anything, frequently innocent of any wrongdoing, occasionally guilty of something far short of what online rumor accuses them of, absorb a version of public judgment that the justice system itself, with its procedural safeguards, evidentiary standards, and burden of proof, was specifically designed to prevent. This pattern has played out in different specific forms in numerous other cases across the country over the past 2 decades, and it tends to follow the same arc regardless of location, regardless of the races involved, regardless of which political or media ecosystem picks it up first. Enormous initial attention, a bitter and often racially or ideologically charged public fight over interpretation, and then, eventually, whatever the actual legal process concludes arriving quietly months or years later to an audience a fraction the size of the one that consumed the initial controversy. That pattern matters here, specifically, because it should recalibrate expectations about how this case is likely to end, from a media standpoint, if nothing else. Whatever the sealed autopsy findings eventually show once the grand jury has reviewed them, whatever becomes of the defamation matter against Sharpton, there is a real possibility that the eventual, careful, fully evidenced answer to what happened to Nolan Wells reaches a small fraction of the audience that consumed the loudest, angriest version of this story back when it was new. That is not a reason to stop covering it carefully. It's exactly the reason to. Let's lay out, in order, where the actual documented parts of this timeline stand, separate from the online argument layered on top of them, because with this many moving pieces it's easy to lose track of the plain sequence. July 4th, the day of the gathering. Roughly 300 people, reportedly, spend the day on and around Horn Island. GPS data places Nolan's boat leaving the mainland at 9:56 a.m. and arriving at the island by 11:14. The last confirmed photo of him alive is timestamped 2:23 p.m. In the late afternoon, a subset of the group, including Warren Hudson, Jax Patalo, and Morgan Seymour, begins heading back after their boat reportedly takes on water and requires assistance. Nolan, according to their account, chooses to remain behind with a young woman rather than leave with them. That boat departs the island at 4:31 p.m. and reaches the mainland dock by 6:06 that evening. That evening, at some point after the group returns without Nolan, concern escalates. Around 11 that night, the Coast Guard receives a call from one of Nolan's friends, and Christine Wells Wansley separately calls to report her son missing. By 11:49 p.m., the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources has been contacted, and the Jackson County Sheriff's Office opens a missing person report. By 1:38 the following morning, that office has formally taken the lead on the investigation. July 5th, an active search launches at 8 a.m., involving multiple agencies, drone flights, and sonar surveys, though the search is later paused because of weather. July 6th, at 8:45 in the morning, a United States Park Service ranger discovers a body at the northwestern tip of Horn Island. It's transported to the coroner's office by late morning. Before 1 p.m. that day, Nolan's family confirms his death publicly. July 7th, Nolan's official autopsy is performed at the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office, and the family formally retains Ben Crump. Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lind reports finding no obvious physical injuries on Nolan's body. Sheriff John Ledbetter states, at this early stage, that no signs of foul play have been identified. Cause and manner of death, as of this video, remain undetermined. That is not commentary or hedging on our part. It is the specific, official classification both the state's official autopsy and the family's independent one have arrived at, for reasons we're about to walk through in detail. In the days after, a GoFundMe organized to help the family had raised more than $320,000 by July 16th. Producer and media mogul Byron Allen donated $100,000 to it directly. Attorney Ben Crump's team becomes involved on July 7th by Christine Wells Wansley's own account at the family's initiative rather than Crump's team reaching out first, and the NAACP would go on to join Nolan's legal team the following month. Tyler Perry announces he'll cover the funeral costs. Colin Kaepernick's initiative funds an independent autopsy, performed by Dr. Roger A. Mitchell, Jr., president of Howard University Hospital and a forensic pathologist with no ties to Mississippi law enforcement, a choice the family has said reflects their lack of trust in the local process. Other public figures, including Spike Lee, Eric Benet, and MC Lyte, publicly offer support. July 20th. Nolan's funeral is held. Reverend Al Sharpton delivers the eulogy and pledges a $50,000 reward for information about the circumstances of Nolan's death. Tyler Perry matches it, bringing the total reward to $100,000. July 22nd. The results of the family's independent autopsy come back. Dr. Mitchell's report describes no bone fractures and no deep tissue injuries, but notes an unexplained area of red discoloration on the back of Nolan's skull. Because the state medical examiner's office had already removed and retained Nolan's lungs and neck structures during its own autopsy, Dr. Mitchell states he cannot determine whether water was present in Nolan's lungs or whether there was any injury to his neck, meaning his independent findings, like the state's, come back listed as undetermined, with non-accidental causes not ruled out. July 23rd. The district attorney, Angel Myers McElrath, announces that the official state autopsy's findings will remain sealed, to be presented to a grand jury before any public disclosure. It's worth explaining, briefly, the actual legal tension that decision sits inside, because sealing a record isn't simply a discretionary choice a prosecutor makes on a whim. It exists in real tension with public records law. Mississippi, like every state, has a public records statute generally requiring government-held documents to be accessible to the public and the press, built on the premise that citizens have a right to know what their government is doing. That general presumption of openness gives way, in most state statutes, to a specific, recognized exception for active criminal investigation records, precisely because premature disclosure can compromise a prosecution, taint a jury pool, or reveal information only the real perpetrator, if there is one, would know. A detail investigators sometimes deliberately withhold specifically to weed out false confessions and unreliable witnesses. Sealing the autopsy pending grand jury review sits squarely inside that recognized exception, not outside it. It is, procedurally, one of the most ordinary, unremarkable prosecutorial decisions in this entire case, however suspicious it understandably feels to a family desperate for answers. Late July into August, the case's public life shifts from an investigation story into a media and racial framing story. Pastor Jamal Bryant, with the family present, delivers a sermon invoking the Genesis account of Cain and Abel, declaring the moment a chance to end a cycle of vicious, violent racism, and calling on Mississippi's governor to intervene. Commentator Brandon Tatum, host of The Officer Tatum Show, pushes back publicly and repeatedly, stating he does not believe race was a factor in Nolan's death, and later hosting Warren Hudson, Jack Spatalo, and Morgan Seymour directly on his program, an appearance that drew its own separate wave of criticism, including from sports journalist Jemele Hill. Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves and State Senator Jeremy England publicly back Sheriff Ledbetter's handling of the investigation. Commentators, including Jason Whitlock, accuse Crump of racializing the case. Others, including CNN analyst Charles Ramsey, caution that drawing conclusions before the autopsy's release is unfair to the family regardless of which direction those conclusions point. Whoopi Goldberg and Sunny Hostin, on The View, argue that given Mississippi's specific history, questions about race are not unreasonable to ask, whatever this specific case turns out to show. Also during this period, Warren Hudson, Jack Spatalo, and Morgan Seymour launched their own fundraiser on a platform called Give Send Go to help cover legal costs, raising more than $90,000 by early August, according to public reporting. Ben Hudson, Warren's father, states publicly that he intends to pursue his own legal action against Crump for what he calls false accusations of murder. Also emerging in this window, a video circulated publicly by Crump's team, appearing to capture an argument on the island, with a voice shouting, "Give me my freaking phone. What are you freaking doing?" A clip presented as potentially connected to Nolan. A young man named Tracyston Shepard came forward to state that the voice in the video was his own, not Nolan's, and that the argument was a separate dispute between himself and another man over Shepard's girlfriend, an account independent reporting corroborated with Shepard's girlfriend and uncle. A separate photograph, showing Nolan at a pool party with a group of friends and circulated as possible evidence he'd returned to the mainland alive on July 5th, was likewise clarified by Shepard and corroborated independently as having been taken more than a week earlier, on June 27th. Early August, the FBI opens involvement in the case, a routine matter, according to Sheriff Ledbetter, given that Horn Island sits inside the federally managed Gulf Islands National Seashore and the department's standing practice of working with the FBI on cases involving federal land. Investigators report having interviewed roughly 60 witnesses at this point, with no foul play identified yet, while the FBI separately reviews digital evidence gathered during the investigation. Threats connected to the case escalate to the point of federal charges. A man in Sacramento is arrested on July 30th for allegedly sending threatening messages to Judge Ashley Cole, Warren Hudson's stepmother and, notably, a sitting judge, who along with her son deletes her social media accounts after the threats begin. A woman in Ohio is arrested for phoning in bomb threats to Jackson County offices. A man in Illinois is arrested on August 4th for threatening witnesses connected to the case. The Congressional Black Caucus, in August, formally calls on the U.S. Department of Justice to open its own independent review of the case. August 19th and 20th, hundreds gather at Greater St. John AME Church in Biloxi for a prayer vigil on what would have been Nolan's 19th birthday. Pastor Jamal Bryant delivers the keynote, demanding both answers in the investigation and an end to the online attacks directed at Christine Wells Wansley and, according to some coverage, sharply criticizing the district attorney's handling of the sealed autopsy findings. Filmmaker Spike Lee, who had also attended Nolan's funeral, is among those present, alongside local elected officials. August 21st, attorneys representing Warren Hudson, Jax Patalo, and Morgan Seymour send a formal letter to Reverend Al Sharpton, 19 pages long, threatening a defamation lawsuit over statements including a July 14th interview in which Sharpton said he was stunned that Nolan went missing a day later after being with 3 white friends and that no one comes forward. Language the letter argues insinuates the 3 young men had some role in his death. The letter demands an apology and disputes specific claims regarding the phone, the keys, and the size of the group present that day. Sharpton's public response: "I welcome the lawsuit and will have my attorneys be in touch with theirs to arrange for them to serve me so we can get in court." As of this video, cause and manner of death remain officially undetermined. No charges have been filed against anyone. The official autopsy's findings remain sealed pending grand jury review, a process that, as of late August, has not yet concluded. The defamation matter against Sharpton remains, as far as public reporting shows, at the demand letter stage rather than a filed lawsuit. 3 separate people, by this point, have been formally charged with threatening a judge, a witness, and local officials tied to this investigation. And notably, none of the 3 appear to have had any actual connection to Nolan, his family, or the boating group. They are, as far as reporting shows, strangers to this case who involved themselves anyway. State officials have also had to begin warning the public that fake documents purporting to be from this investigation are circulating online, a genuinely alarming escalation, because it means that even setting aside every honest disagreement this video has already covered, some of what's spreading about this case at this point isn't a matter of interpretation or emphasis at all. It's simply fabricated. A newly completed independent analytical review of the available photographs, videos, GPS coordinates, and witness accounts has concluded that a material gap still exists in the timeline, specifically between the last independently corroborated sighting of Nolan and the reported departure of the boat that carried him and his friends to the island. that finding doesn't accuse anyone of anything. It confirms, from an independent analytical standpoint, exactly what this video has been saying throughout. The documented record has a real, acknowledged hole in it, and neither autopsy, official or independent, has been able to fill that hole with a conclusive answer. It's worth explaining, briefly, what an analytical review like that one actually involves, because independent analysis can sound like a vague credibility stamp rather than a specific, describable method. A review of this kind typically cross-references every piece of available time-stamped material, metadata embedded in photographs and videos, GPS logs from phones and boats, and the substance of every witness statement, against every other piece, looking for points where the record can be corroborated by at least two independent sources and points where it can't. A material gap is the technical term for exactly what it sounds like, a stretch of time where the analysts could not find corroborating material connecting one confirmed data point to the next, meaning the record simply goes quiet for a period, with nothing independently verifiable filling it in. That's different from evidence of wrongdoing. It's an honest acknowledgement of the limits of what's currently documented, which is, in its own way, the single most useful sentence anyone investigating this case from the outside has produced so far, because it tells you exactly where the genuine uncertainty in this story actually lives, rather than where any one side's narrative prefers to locate it. It's worth closing this recap with the same caution we opened this video with. Almost every sentence in that timeline above carries some degree of qualification, reportedly, according to commentary, as far as public reporting shows, and that isn't hedging for its own sake. It reflects the actual, current state of public knowledge about this case, which is considerably thinner and more contested than the volume of commentary surrounding it would suggest. Let's go back and sit with Warren Hudson, Jack Spatalo, and Morgan Seymour individually for a moment, because throughout most of the commentary this case has generated, they get discussed as an undifferentiated unit, the boys, the white kids, the group, in a way that mirrors, uncomfortably, the same flattening this channel has criticized on the other side of this dispute. Whatever their individual roles turn out to have been that day, they are three separate teenagers, each now living through a version of public suspicion most adults never have to face at any point in their lives, each presumably processing the death of someone they called a friend while simultaneously defending themselves against accusations of having caused it. Warren, according to the record laid out in this video, appears to be the one whose account carries the most direct documentation. The phone calls to Christine Wells Wansley, to the Coast Guard, to law enforcement, and the public interview in which he described the last time he saw Nolan alive. That level of documentation cuts in a specific direction worth naming. It is considerably harder to dismiss a detailed, time-stamped account, corroborated by call records, as fabricated after the fact than it would be to dismiss a vague or evolving one. Whether that documentation holds up under whatever formal investigative scrutiny it eventually receives is a separate question from whether it's detailed, but a person constructing a false account under pressure typically doesn't volunteer a minute-by-minute call log that can be checked against phone company records. That's not proof of innocence. It is, however, a specific, checkable claim, which is more than a great deal of what's been said about this case by commentators on every side can claim for itself. Jax and Morgan appear far less individually in the public record than Warren does, at least based on what's referenced across the commentary this video draws from. They're named as part of the group, as co-plaintiffs in the defamation letter, as fellow targets of threats and harassment, but without the same level of individual public statement Warren has made. That's worth noting not as a suspicious omission, but as a reminder that public attention in cases like this one rarely distributes evenly across everyone involved. It tends to concentrate on whichever individual has spoken publicly, been interviewed, or become the most visible face of a group, regardless of whether that concentration reflects anything meaningful about that person's actual role relative to the others. It's worth pausing, too, on what it might mean developmentally and psychologically for a group of teenagers or young adults to spend a summer that should have been an ordinary transition into adulthood, a last summer before college, a first summer working, whatever the specific stage each of them was at, instead absorbing national-level public accusation, reported threats against family members, and the particular kind of scrutiny that comes from being discussed by name on channels with audiences in the hundreds of thousands or millions. Adolescent and young adult psychological research on public shaming and viral accusation even in cases eventually resolved entirely in the accused person's favor, has documented lasting effects: hypervigilance, difficulty trusting new relationships, a lingering sense that one's name is permanently searchable and permanently tainted regardless of eventual vindication. We are not diagnosing Warren, Jax, or Morgan with anything, and we don't have access to their individual psychological states. But it's worth naming, in general terms, that eventually cleared and unaffected are not the same outcome, and that a young person publicly accused of involvement in a peer's death, even if that accusation is eventually shown to be entirely baseless, does not simply return to the life they had before the accusation began. Now, let's turn that same lens back toward Christine Wells Wansley, because the same principle applies with equal force to her. Whatever the eventual facts of this case turn out to be, she is a mother who has spent this entire summer without her son, managing that loss in the most public, most contested, most relentlessly scrutinized way imaginable. Every public statement dissected, every decision about the GoFundMe money second-guessed, every emotional reaction analyzed for what it might reveal about a case whose actual facts she may understand no better than anyone else watching from the outside. Grief researchers who study loss under public scrutiny, a body of work that's grown considerably since the rise of social media, studying parents of missing or deceased children whose cases went viral, have documented a genuinely difficult secondary trauma that compounds the original loss: the sense of being simultaneously mourned with and doubted, supported and accused, often by people who present themselves as the same audience. We are not asserting anything specific about Christine Wells Wansley's internal experience. We are saying, in general terms, that losing a child publicly, under this level of scrutiny, is its own distinct and well-documented form of suffering, layered directly on top of the loss itself. It's worth naming specifically just how far up the political and institutional ladder this case's dividing lines actually run, because it isn't only pundits and pastors arguing about it. Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves and State Senator Jeremy England have both publicly backed Sheriff Ledbetter's handling of the investigation, effectively staking state political credibility on the position that the local process is being run properly. A notable choice given that both men answer to a statewide electorate that includes constituents who feel very differently about this case, and given that publicly backing a specific sheriff's specific handling of a specific ongoing investigation is the kind of statement that can become politically costly later if the eventual facts end up cutting against the position they've staked out now. Sports commentator Jason Whitlock has accused Ben Crump directly of racializing the case and stirring up animus that didn't need to exist, a criticism consistent with positions Whitlock has taken in other prior, high-profile cases involving Crump, part of an ongoing, years-long public disagreement between the two men over how race should factor into coverage of cases like this one. Meaning his specific critique here is best understood as a continuation of a long-running position rather than a reaction unique to the facts of Nolan's case. On the other side, CNN analyst Charles Ramsey, himself a former police commissioner who has led major city departments and testified before Congress on policing reform, has cautioned that drawing hard conclusions before the sealed autopsy is released does a disservice to the family, regardless of which direction those conclusions point. A notably more measured position than either side's loudest advocates have taken, and one that carries particular weight given Ramsey's own career sitting at the intersection of law enforcement leadership and civil rights reform, a background that makes him harder to dismiss as reflexively siding with either the department under scrutiny or the family demanding answers from it. And on The View, Whoopi Goldberg and Sunny Hostin argued that Mississippi's specific, documented history makes questions about race entirely reasonable to ask here, whatever this particular case's facts eventually show. It's worth noting that The View itself occupies a specific, deliberately structured role in exactly this kind of national conversation, a daytime program built around hosts with genuinely different political and cultural perspectives debating the news of the day in real time, which means its coverage of a case like this one functions less as investigative reporting and more as a live sample of how a case like this is actually landing across different segments of the national audience, argued out loud rather than left implicit the way it usually is in more traditional news coverage. Ben Hudson, Warren's father, has said he intends to pursue his own legal action against Crump directly, accusing him of spreading what he calls an obviously false narrative of murder, a potential second, separate legal front layered on top of the defamation matter against Sharpton, aimed instead at the attorney who's represented the Wells family since the case's earliest days. That range, a sitting governor, a national sports commentator, a CNN law enforcement analyst, daytime television hosts, and a father threatening his own lawsuit, tells you this case stopped being a local Mississippi story a long time ago and is now functioning as a proxy fight for a much larger, much older national argument that has very little to do with the specific facts of what happened to one 18-year-old on one afternoon in July. None of these public figures has access to information the rest of us don't have. Every single one of them is reacting to the same sealed autopsy, the same undetermined manner of death, the same material gap in the timeline that this video has walked through in detail, which means every confident public statement from every one of these prominent voices is, whether they acknowledge it or not, an opinion formed on genuinely incomplete information, exactly like everyone else's. It's worth pausing on one more general pattern before we move toward closing this out. The way cases like this one tend to produce, almost mechanically, two entirely separate media ecosystems that rarely engage with each other honestly, each one built around a different set of trusted sources, a different framing of the underlying facts, and, over time, a different audience that increasingly never encounters the other side's version of events at all. Viewers who found this story through Pastor Bryant's sermon or through commentary sympathetic to the Wells family are likely to have absorbed an almost entirely different set of known facts than viewers who found the story through commentary defending Warren Hudson, Jack Spatalo, and Morgan Seymour. Both audiences, by now, likely believe they have the complete picture. Neither one, based purely on what's actually been publicly verified as of this video, actually does, and that fracturing, more than almost anything else about this case, is what makes it feel so much larger and more intractable than the underlying, still unresolved facts currently justify. This fracturing isn't unique to this case, either. It's a structural feature of how information spreads now, in any sufficiently viral, sufficiently contested story. Algorithmic recommendation systems on nearly every major platform are optimized to keep a viewer engaged, not to present a balanced accounting of a disputed case, which means a viewer who watches one video sympathetic to the Wells family is likely to be shown more videos in that same vein, and a viewer who watches one video sympathetic to Warren Hudson, Jack Spatalo, and Morgan Seymour is likely to be shown more of those. Over the course of weeks, this can produce two audiences who technically watched coverage of the exact same case and came away with almost entirely non-overlapping sets of facts, assumptions, and conclusions. Not because either audience is uniquely gullible, but because the information environment itself is structured to deepen whichever initial impression a viewer happened to form first. Recognizing that structural pull is, in itself, a small defense against it. The next time a piece of commentary about this case, or any case like it, makes you feel a surge of total certainty in one direction, it's worth asking whether that certainty came from the strength of the actual evidence, or from having simply been shown 10 more videos that already agreed with the first one. It's worth going back to Javon Williams for a moment, because his specific position in this dispute is a good illustration of exactly how messy the actual, on-the-record evidence is once you look past the confident summaries on either side. Williams is a friend of Nolan's who has publicly questioned the account that Nolan chose to separate from the group, but when it came to the circulated video of someone shouting about a phone, Williams was also the person who confirmed that the voice wasn't Nolan's, while stopping short of being able to identify whose voice it actually was. That means one of the family's own named supporters simultaneously undercut one specific piece of viral evidence against the boy's account, while also publicly disputing another specific piece of the boy's own account. Williams isn't neatly sorted onto either side of this dispute, and neither, once you look closely, is almost anyone else directly connected to this case. It's mostly the commentary built on top of their statements that insists on sorting everyone into exactly two teams. Before we get to what happens next, let's address a handful of the specific questions that keep coming up around this case, because if you've been following it at all, at least a couple of these have probably crossed your mind too. Did Nolan drown? Or is something else suspected? Both the official state autopsy and the family's independent one have come back listing cause and manner of death as undetermined, for the specific forensic reasons we walked through earlier, most notably that the state's autopsy retained Nolan's lungs and neck structures, preventing the independent pathologist from confirming or ruling out drowning or neck injury on his own exam. That is not the same as foul play being confirmed, and it is not the same as an accidental drowning being confirmed either. It means the physical evidence, as of this video, has not settled the question either way. Why did the family go to Ben Crump instead of a local attorney? Christine Wells Wansley has stated this was her own initiative, arrived at after a moment of prayer, and that Crump's team did not reach out to the family first. Critics have suggested the choice signals a deliberate racial or financial strategy. Both explanations are possible from what's public. Neither has been proven. Are Warren Hudson, Jax Patalo, and Morgan Seymour facing any charges? No, not as of this video. Sheriff Ledbetter has stated that no signs of foul play had been identified as investigators worked through roughly 60 witness interviews, and the official autopsy findings are sealed pending grand jury review, which has not yet concluded. Reaching a grand jury does not, on its own, tell us whether charges will ultimately be sought against anyone specifically or against no one at all. What actually happens if the defamation lawsuit against Al Sharpton gets filed for real? It would open a separate civil legal track, running on the private figure defamation standard described earlier in this video, requiring Warren Hudson, Jax Patalo, and Morgan Seymour's attorneys to show that specific statements, including Sharpton's July 14th comments about Nolan going missing a day later, after being with 3 white friends and no one coming forward, were false, communicated to others, and made without adequate care for the truth. Sharpton has publicly said he welcomes the suit. It would not, by itself, resolve anything about what happened to Nolan. It would resolve only whether specific public statements about the 3 of them crossed a specific legal line. Is the GoFundMe money going to be investigated? Nothing in what's public as of this video indicates a formal fraud investigation into either fundraiser, the Wells family's GoFundMe, or the boys' own Give Send Go campaign, has been opened. Public scrutiny and a formal investigation are different things. The first requires only sustained attention and suspicion. The second requires a complaint serious enough, or evidence specific enough, for a regulatory body or law enforcement agency to actually open a file. As of now, what exists is the former for both fundraisers, not confirmation of the latter for either one. What was the video and photo controversy actually about? Material circulated by Crump's team, an audio clip of someone shouting about a phone, and a photo of Nolan at a pool party, was presented in ways that invited the public to connect both to the circumstances of his death. Trace's Tin Shepherd came forward to identify the voice in the audio as his own, from an unrelated argument, and to clarify the photo was taken over a week before the 4th of July trip. Independent reporting corroborated both clarifications. Neither piece of material, as it turns out, actually depicts anything from the day Nolan died. Let's talk briefly and carefully about the documented racial disparities that sit underneath Pastor Bryant's framing, because understanding that broader research is useful even while we've already been clear that it doesn't automatically resolve this specific case. Researchers studying missing persons coverage over the past 2 decades have repeatedly documented what's sometimes called missing white woman syndrome, a well-established pattern in which missing or deceased white women and girls, particularly young, attractive, middle-class ones, receive dramatically more sustained national media coverage than missing persons of color with otherwise comparable circumstances. Studies analyzing cable news airtime, newspaper column inches, and more recently social media engagement have found this disparity to be real, measurable, and persistent across multiple decades of American media coverage, not merely a subjective impression. That is a documented, general pattern, separate and apart from anything specific to Nolan Wells' case. Whether that broader pattern explains any specific feature of how this particular case has been investigated or covered is a separate, much narrower question that the general research cannot answer on its own. General statistical patterns describe tendencies across large numbers of cases. They don't establish what happened in any one specific case without additional, case-specific evidence. It's entirely possible for the broader disparity to be real and well-documented, and for this specific case's pace or coverage to be explained by entirely different, non-racial factors: the sheer size and chaos of the gathering, the ordinary timeline of toxicology testing, the complexity of reconciling dozens of witness accounts. It's also possible for both to be true simultaneously, in ways that are difficult to cleanly separate from the outside. Naming the general research honestly, without either dismissing it or treating it as automatically dispositive of this specific case, is the most intellectually honest way to hold this part of the conversation, and it's notably harder to do than simply picking whichever conclusion your existing politics already prefers. It's also worth explaining, in general terms, what large civil rights-oriented legal teams like Ben Crump's actually tend to do procedurally in cases like this one, separate from the specific motives commentators have speculated about. These teams typically combine public advocacy, press conferences, media appearances, a visible national platform, with more conventional legal work, securing independent forensic review, coordinating with or pressuring local investigators to share information with the family, and preparing the groundwork for a potential civil suit well before any criminal process concludes, precisely because a civil claim, as we discussed earlier, doesn't require waiting on a criminal case's outcome. This combination of public pressure and private legal preparation is a deliberate strategy used across many prominent cases, built on the premise that sustained public attention itself can be a meaningful tool for getting a case the investigative resources and institutional urgency it might not otherwise receive. Reasonable people disagree about whether that strategy, on balance, serves justice or distorts it by pressuring institutions through public opinion rather than evidence alone, but understanding that it's a known, established legal and advocacy approach, rather than something uniquely invented for this case, is useful context for evaluating why this specific legal team operates the way it does. It's worth being fair, too, about the corresponding strategy on the other side of this dispute, because Warren Hudson, Jack Spatalo, and Morgan Seymour's attorneys are running a comparably deliberate playbook of their own, just aimed in the opposite direction. A defamation demand letter sent to a nationally prominent figure, made public through independent reporting rather than kept private between the parties, functions as its own form of public pressure. It invites coverage. It shapes a media narrative around the boys as wrongly accused rather than merely accused, and it stakes out a public position of total confidence before any court has weighed the underlying facts. Exactly the same rhetorical move Crump's public advocacy makes from the opposite direction. Neither side's legal team is doing anything improper by combining formal legal process with public narrative shaping. It's simply how high-stakes representation works in a case this visible, on every side of it, and recognizing that both legal teams are running comparable strategies, rather than treating one side's public advocacy as principled and the other's as manipulative, is part of holding this case with the even-handedness it actually requires. It's worth naming, briefly and in general terms, the specific psychological mechanism that makes a case like this one so hard for otherwise reasonable people to reason clearly about, motivated reasoning, and the specific form of it researchers sometimes call identity protective cognition. People don't generally process evidence about a racially and politically charged case the way they'd process a neutral fact. They process it, often unconsciously, in a way that protects a broader identity or worldview they've already invested in. A viewer who already believes the justice system treats Black families unfairly is inclined to interpret every ambiguous detail in this case as confirming that belief. A viewer who already believes race-based accusations get thrown around too loosely is inclined to interpret the same ambiguous details as confirming that belief instead. Neither viewer is necessarily acting in bad faith. Both are running the same well-documented cognitive process, just starting from different priors, and understanding that this is a documented, near-universal feature of how people process identity-relevant information, rather than a moral failing unique to the other side, is a genuinely useful piece of context for anyone trying to actually think clearly about a case like this one, including, honestly, the people making this video. There's a broader question worth sitting with as we move toward closing this out, one that extends well past Nolan Wells specifically. What actually happens to a community's ability to find the truth in a case like this, when the online information environment rewards confidence over accuracy, speed over verification, and total certainty over the far less satisfying, far more honest position of "we don't fully know yet"? Media literacy researchers have described this dynamic as a kind of collective epistemic erosion. Not that any individual viewer is unusually gullible, but that an information ecosystem optimized for engagement systematically punishes the very qualities that produce accurate understanding of a genuinely uncertain situation: patience, tolerance for ambiguity, willingness to update a belief when new facts arrive. A case like this one becomes, almost by design, a stress test for whether an audience can hold that kind of patience. And based on the sheer volume and intensity of confident, competing claims this case has already generated after only a few months, it's fair to say the test, so far, is not going especially well. Let's talk about the people who've reportedly been arrested for threatening individuals connected to this case, because it's worth understanding, in general terms, what actually turns online harassment into a criminal matter, since a lot of commentary treats online threats as a vague, unpunishable nuisance rather than something with real legal teeth. In most states, a communication rises to the level of a criminal threat when it conveys a genuine, specific intent to cause harm, rather than general hostility, insult, or hyperbole. Courts generally distinguish between someone expressing anger, even ugly and aggressive anger, and someone communicating what a reasonable person would perceive as a real threat of violence. Multiple people being arrested in connection with threats made against Warren's father, against a stepmother, and against others connected to this case tells you that whatever was said crossed that line clearly enough for law enforcement to act on it. An important distinction from the enormous volume of merely hostile, insulting commentary that, however ugly, doesn't rise to a prosecutable threshold. It's a useful reminder that the same digital platforms carrying this case's substantive debate are also carrying, simultaneously, a current of real criminal conduct directed at private individuals who did not choose to become public figures. It's worth being specific about the three separate categories of criminal conduct that emerged around this case, because they're legally distinct from one another, even though commentary tends to lump them together as the threats. The man arrested in Sacramento faced federal charges specifically because threatening messages sent across state lines over the internet to intimidate someone in another state can trigger federal interstate threat statutes rather than staying a purely local matter. A meaningful escalation since federal prosecutors generally have more resources and, in these specific statutes, often steeper sentencing exposure than a comparable state-level charge would carry. The Ohio woman's bomb threats to Jackson County offices fall under a different, and in most jurisdictions even more severely punished, category. Falsely reporting an explosive device is treated as a serious felony almost everywhere in the country, in part because it forces a genuine, resource-draining emergency response, evacuations, bomb-sniffing units, and actual disruption of government function, regardless of whether any device was ever real. And the Illinois man arrested for threatening witnesses touches a third distinct legal category, witness intimidation, which courts and legislatures treat with particular severity because it strikes directly at the judicial process itself. A threat aimed at silencing a witness doesn't just harm that individual, it potentially corrupts the fact-finding process the entire case depends on. 3 different people, 3 different specific statutes, 3 different reasons the legal system treats each of these categories as serious, but all 3 converging on the same underlying case, which tells you something about just how combustible this story has become for people who have no actual connection to it at all. That cuts against a temptation worth naming directly because it's a very human one. The temptation, when you feel strongly that one side of a contested case is right, to see aggressive harassment against the other side as somehow deserved, or at least understandable in a way you would never extend to harassment against people you sympathize with. It's worth resisting that instinct specifically because it doesn't scale. A norm that says harassment is fine when it's aimed at people I've decided are guilty is a norm that will eventually be turned against someone you believe is innocent, in some other case by people who feel just as certain about their own side as you currently feel about yours. Let's look at the 4 adults whose lives are most directly entangled in this case's aftermath, side by side, the way we would in any case with this many people carrying different pieces of the same story. Christine Wells Wansley, a mother who lost an 18-year-old son, who has organized and defended a large public fundraiser now under public scrutiny, who has stated publicly that she is not currently able to return to work, who has faced a complaint against her professional license and describes experiencing online harassment, and who has, by her own account, sought outside legal help in a moment of prayer and crisis rather than through any calculated strategy. Whatever the eventual facts of this case show about anyone else involved, her underlying loss is not in dispute by anyone on any side of this argument. Warren Hudson, the young man with the most detailed, most publicly documented account of that night, a specific last sighting time, a specific departure time, a specific sequence of phone calls to Nolan's mother, the Coast Guard, and law enforcement. Now a lead plaintiff, through his attorneys, in a defamation matter against one of the country's most prominent public figures, connected to a father who has stated his own intent to pursue legal action against Ben Crump, and connected to a stepmother, Judge Ashley Cole, who is herself a sitting member of the judiciary and who has had to delete her social media accounts after threats serious enough to result in a federal arrest. Jax Patalo and Morgan Seymour, named consistently alongside Warren Hudson as part of the group present that day and as co-plaintiffs in the same defamation matter, but with considerably less individual public statement in the record this video has access to. A reminder that public attention in a case like this rarely distributes evenly, and that a quieter public profile doesn't necessarily mean a smaller role in either direction for people for very different positions in the same story. And as of this video, not one of them has been formally, legally found to have done anything wrong or anything right. A grieving mother facing public suspicion about money. 3 young men facing public suspicion about a death none of them, according to their own sworn account, had anything to do with. That is the actual, current shape of this case, stripped of the commentary layered on top of it, considerably messier and considerably more uncertain than either side's most confident supporters would have you believe. If any part of this story feels uncomfortably familiar to you personally, not the scale of it, not the national attention, but the underlying experience of watching an argument about a real tragedy get taken over by people who never knew the person at the center of it, that discomfort is worth trusting. It's the same instinct that made Warren Hudson, Jax Patalo, and Morgan Seymour's attorneys draft a 19-page letter instead of just waiting the accusations out. And it's the same instinct that presumably makes Christine Wells Wansley want the actual truth about her son's death publicly known, rather than buried under an argument about race and money that has very little to do with him personally. Wanting the noise to stop and the actual facts to surface is not a position that belongs to only one side of this dispute. It's the one thing, underneath everything else, that almost everyone directly connected to this story actually seems to want. Think for a moment about the parents in your own life. Maybe you, maybe someone you know, who have lain awake after their own teenager left for a lake trip, a beach weekend, a gathering with 100 people they only half recognize by name. Most of the time, that anxiety resolves itself by mourning with a phone call and a groan about worrying for nothing. Christine Wells Wansley is living the version of that fear that never resolves, that keeps escalating instead, from a missed check-in to a search to a recovery to a funeral to a fight that somehow still hasn't ended months later. You don't need to have any opinion at all about Ben Crump or Jamal Bryant or the specific numbers in a GoFundMe accounting to understand that particular terror. Most people who have ever raised a teenager already do. And think, too, about the version of this fear that belongs to Warren Hudson, Jax Patalo, and Morgan Seymour's parents. A different fear, but not a smaller one. The fear of watching your child's name turned into a national symbol for a debate they never asked to be part of answering the phone to hear that your family has been threatened over something your son says he had no part in, of not knowing whether the version of your child that strangers online have already decided on will ever be replaced in the public's mind by whatever the actual, verified truth eventually turns out to be. Neither of these fears cancels the other out. Both of them are being lived in real time by real families right now, while an audience of millions treats their situation as a case study in a debate about race and media that most of those viewers will move on from within a week. It's worth saying something directly to anyone watching this who has ever been on the receiving end of a pile-on like the one aimed at Warren, Jax, Morgan, and their families, or, for that matter, like the one aimed at Christine Wells Wansley. It doesn't matter whether the pile-on you experienced involved a fraction of this case's national attention or none at all. The psychological experience of being publicly, confidently accused of something you say you didn't do, by people who will never have to sit with the consequences of being wrong, is a recognizable and well-documented form of harm regardless of scale. If you've lived through any version of that, what you experienced was real, even if it never made a headline and even if the people around you moved on from it faster than you did. Let's close out the legal side of this by explaining, plainly, what actually has to happen before any of the open threads in this case reach something resembling a real resolution. The official autopsy is already complete and sealed. What's still needed is for the grand jury to actually convene and reach a decision, which, as we explained earlier, could mean an indictment against someone, or could just as easily mean a formal declination closing the criminal matter without charges against anyone. The defamation matter against Sharpton would need to move from a demand letter into an actual filed lawsuit, and then through discovery, motions, and potentially a trial or settlement, a process that in ordinary civil litigation frequently takes well over a year from filing to resolution. And any wrongful death claim the Wells family might choose to pursue, against whoever they might choose to name, would run on its own entirely separate timeline, again requiring its own discovery process and its own eventual resolution, whether by settlement or trial. None of those 4 tracks are likely to resolve quickly, and none of them are likely to resolve at the same time as each other. That means the honest expectation for anyone following this case is the same one we'd give for any case this legally layered. Don't expect a clean, singular ending anytime soon. Expect pieces of resolution arriving separately, over months or years, likely well after most of the current online audience has stopped paying attention entirely. It's worth explaining, too, what an undetermined classification actually means for the family in a very concrete, bureaucratic sense that rarely comes up in commentary about this case: Nolan's death certificate. Every state requires an official cause and manner of death be recorded on that document, and undetermined is itself a valid, formal classification, not a placeholder awaiting a later revision, though it can be amended if new evidence later justifies changing it. That classification has real downstream consequences that have nothing to do with the criminal investigation at all. It can affect how life insurance claims are processed, since many policies pay out differently or require additional review. When a death is not clearly ruled accidental, it can affect the framing of any wrongful death claim the family eventually pursues, since a plaintiff's attorney generally has an easier time arguing negligence or liability when a specific, established cause of death exists to build a causal argument around, and it means that, absent new evidence, Nolan's official government record of his own death may permanently read undetermined, a genuinely unusual, unresolved status for a family to have to live with indefinitely, entirely separate from whatever the grand jury or any future civil case eventually concludes. If you're old enough to remember what following a major news story looked like before every phone in every pocket could live stream a press conference or a sermon in real time, it's worth pausing on how different this entire case would have unfolded even 15 years ago. A GoFundMe of this size didn't exist as a concept much before the early 2010s. A pastor's sermon reaching millions of people who never set foot in his church, clipped and recirculated within hours, is a distinctly modern phenomenon. A defamation demand letter leaking to independent reporters and spreading before the intended recipient has even formally responded is something the speed of today's information environment makes almost inevitable in a way it wouldn't have been in an earlier media era. None of that makes the underlying human story, a missing teenager, a grieving mother, 3 frightened friends, any different than it would have been in any other decade. What's different is the sheer velocity and scale at which every reaction, every rumor, and every legal maneuver now becomes public, permanent, and inseparable from the original tragedy within days rather than months. That velocity is worth naming honestly as its own kind of harm, separate from whatever the facts of this specific case turn out to be. A generation ago, a family grieving a death like this one would have had the benefit of time and relative privacy to process what happened before national figures, competing commentary channels, and millions of strangers weighed in with their own theories. That privacy simply doesn't exist anymore for a case that generates this much attention, and it's worth grieving that loss of privacy as its own casualty of how this story has unfolded. Not because anyone involved did anything wrong by speaking publicly, but because the environment itself no longer offers the option of grieving or defending yourself out of the spotlight. It's also worth naming, for anyone watching this who manages a GoFundMe or public fundraiser of any kind, or who has ever donated to one, what this case suggests about best practices going forward, in general terms. Fundraiser organizers in high-attention cases increasingly choose to publish periodic, voluntary accountings of major expenditures, not because platforms require it, but because doing so proactively tends to reduce exactly the kind of suspicion and scrutiny that's attached itself to the Wells family's fundraiser. Whether that would have changed anything about how this specific case's money question unfolded is impossible to know in hindsight. But it's a reasonable lesson other families in similarly tragic, similarly public circumstances might take from watching how this particular controversy developed. Transparency offered voluntarily, before it's demanded, tends to diffuse suspicion considerably more effectively than transparency extracted only after weeks of public pressure. It's worth naming something uncomfortable about this entire case that has nothing to do with race, money, or any of the specific disputed facts. The overwhelming majority of families who lose a child under unclear circumstances never get anything close to this level of attention. No Ben Crump. No NAACP. No Tyler Perry covering a funeral. No Colin Kaepernick funding a second opinion. No national pastor filling a church for a birthday vigil. Most families whose child dies under genuinely ambiguous circumstances, on a lake, at a party, in a car, anywhere outside a hospital's watchful supervision, get a single local news segment, a modest local fundraiser that struggles to cover a funeral, and an investigation that moves at whatever pace a small, underfunded local department can manage, with no outside pressure ever applied to speed it along. That's true regardless of the family's race, though the research on unequal media attention discussed earlier in this video does suggest it's considerably more true for some families than others. Nolan Wells' family getting the scale of resources and attention is, in a very real sense, the exception, not the rule, and it's worth sitting with the fact that whatever this case's flaws in execution, the underlying instinct that produced all of it, a family refusing to let their son's death fade quietly into an unresolved case file, is one that every family in that situation deserves the chance to act on, even if almost none of them ever get the platform to actually do it. Let's return one final time to the specific tension this case keeps generating, because it's the one thing that actually deserves to outlast the rest of this online argument. How do we, as an audience, hold space for a grieving family's legitimate need for answers and their legitimate distrust of institutions that have, historically, failed families who look like theirs, while also holding space for a group of young people's right not to be presumed guilty of causing a friend's death based on nothing more than which boat they happen to be on that day? Those two instincts are not naturally in conflict with each other. They only feel like they are because so much of the commentary surrounding this case has insisted, loudly, that you have to pick exactly one. It's worth being honest about the economics underneath all of this commentary, ours included, because pretending this channel exists outside the same incentive structure as every other voice covering this case would be dishonest. Videos about contested, emotionally charged cases like this one generate attention, and attention generates revenue across every channel discussing it. The ones defending the Wells family, the ones defending Warren Hudson, Jax Patalo, and Morgan Seymour, and this one. That doesn't automatically make any specific claim made by any specific commentator false. It does mean every viewer, including you, watching any video about this case, including this one, should be asking the same question throughout. Is this claim being made because the evidence actually supports it, or because a more dramatic, more certain-sounding version of events performs better than a careful, qualified one? We've tried, throughout this video, to be the second kind of channel rather than the first. Whether we've succeeded is something you're in a better position to judge than we are. Let's explain, briefly, what a toxicology screen in a case like this typically covers, because the phrase gets used constantly in commentary without much explanation of what it actually tests for. A standard postmortem toxicology panel generally screens for alcohol, common drugs of abuse, and, depending on the specific circumstances and what investigators flag as relevant, a broader panel that can include prescription medications and other substances. Results can take anywhere from a few weeks to, in backlogged state labs, several months, depending on the jurisdiction's caseload and whether any results come back requiring additional, more specialized confirmatory testing. In a case involving a large, day-long gathering on the water, a completed toxicology report would likely be one relevant data point among several, rather than a single, case-closing revelation on its own. It might explain contributing factors to a drowning, for instance, without on its own resolving broader questions about what happened in the hours before or after. It's worth explaining, briefly, the layered structure of local government offices actually running this investigation, because commentary tends to treat the investigation as a single, undifferentiated authority rather than several distinct offices with distinct jobs. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office, under Sheriff John Ledbetter, is the lead investigative agency, responsible for gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building the factual record. The Jackson County Coroner, Bruce Lind, is a separate, independently elected office responsible for the initial determination of how a death should be classified and for coordinating with the state medical examiner's office on the forensic side. The Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office, a state-level agency separate from the county entirely, performs the actual official autopsy. And the District Attorney's Office, under Angel Myers McElrath, is a fourth, distinct authority responsible for deciding what evidence goes to a grand jury and, eventually, whether and how to prosecute. Four separate offices, for separate elected or appointed officials, each with a distinct legal role and a distinct set of incentives, which matters because criticism aimed at the investigation as a monolith often actually belongs to one specific office's specific decision, like the DA's choice to seal the autopsy, rather than reflecting how the entire local government apparatus is handling this case. It's worth noting, too, that 3 of those 4 offices, sheriff, coroner, and district attorney, are elected positions in Mississippi, meaning Sheriff Ledbetter, Coroner Lind, and District Attorney McElrath each answer, ultimately, to the same local voters who make up the jury pool, the GoFundMe donor base, and the audience for every piece of commentary this video has discussed. That's worth knowing because it cuts in 2 directions simultaneously. An elected official has a real, structural incentive to actually get a high-profile case right, since a botched investigation carries genuine electoral consequences the next time their name is on a ballot. But an elected official also has a real, structural incentive to avoid any decision that looks politically risky in the moment, even when the politically cautious decision and the substantively correct decision happen to be the same thing, which makes it genuinely difficult from the outside to tell whether a given choice reflects sound judgment or simple risk aversion. It's also worth clarifying, briefly, how jurisdiction typically works in a case like this, because commentary sometimes conflates the Coast Guard's role with that of local or state investigators in a way that overstates what each agency actually does. The Coast Guard's primary role in a case like this is search and rescue, and, where relevant, enforcement of federal maritime law. It is not typically the lead agency conducting a death investigation once a body has been recovered, which generally falls to local sheriffs or police investigators, working alongside a county or state medical examiner's office for the forensic and autopsy side of things, and ultimately a local or state prosecutor's office if any criminal charges are eventually considered. The Coast Guard's phone call role in this timeline is significant for establishing when and how quickly a search began, but any eventual determination about criminal responsibility, if any exists to be made at all, sits with a different set of institutions entirely. Let's go a layer deeper on the actual mechanics of a defamation claim like the one threatened here, because the legal history behind the private figure standard is worth understanding, not just the standard itself. American defamation law's modern shape was set in large part by a landmark Supreme Court case decided in the 1960s, which established that public officials suing over statements related to their official conduct have to prove actual malice, that a false statement was made knowingly or with reckless disregard for the truth, specifically to protect vigorous public debate and criticism of government and public figures from being chilled by the threat of ruinous lawsuits. Courts subsequently extended a similar, though not always identical, heightened standard to public figures more broadly, while preserving a lower bar for private individuals precisely because private individuals haven't voluntarily entered public life and don't have the same platform to correct the record that a public figure typically does. Warren Hudson, Jack Spatalo, and Morgan Seymour becoming widely known through this controversy does not, under this body of law, automatically convert them into public figures for defamation purposes. Courts have generally held that becoming involuntarily famous through someone else's accusation is different from voluntarily seeking a public platform, which is why their attorney's legal strategy leans on the private figure standard rather than accepting the higher public figure bar. If a formal lawsuit is eventually filed and Sharpton side contests it, the case would likely turn heavily on exactly what words were used, in exactly what context, and whether they were framed as established fact or as an open question. A statement like, "These young men need to explain what happened to that phone," sits in a very different legal category than a statement asserting, flatly, that they erased data from it. The first raises a question. The second asserts a specific, checkable fact. If Sharpton's actual statements sit closer to the first category than the demand letter's characterization suggests, that would meaningfully weaken any eventual defamation claim. If they sit closer to the second, it would meaningfully strengthen one. This is exactly the kind of granular, sentence-level dispute defamation litigation actually turns on, far more technical and far less dramatic than either side's public commentary about it has suggested. It's worth pausing specifically on Sharpton's public response to the demand letter. "I welcome the lawsuit and will have my attorneys be in touch with theirs to arrange for them to serve me so we can get in court," because it's a genuinely strategic piece of public messaging, not simply a throwaway line. A defendant who publicly invites a lawsuit is signaling confidence that his own statements will hold up under the exact legal scrutiny a defamation case would apply, that whatever he said was closer to raising a pointed question than asserting a specific false fact, or that he has evidence supporting what he said that hasn't yet become public. It's also, separately, a savvy public relations move regardless of the underlying legal merits. Welcoming a fight publicly reads as more confident than declining to comment, and confidence itself shapes public perception of who's likely to prevail long before any court actually weighs in. None of that tells us who's actually right. It does tell you that both sides of this specific dispute are, for now, playing this out as much in public opinion as in an actual courtroom, and that neither side, as of this video, seems to want to back down. It's worth explaining, too, what actually happens practically if a demand letter like this one is met with compliance rather than litigation, because a public retraction, if Sharpton's team ultimately chooses that path rather than fighting the claim, would itself become a significant, headline-worthy moment in this case, arguably more significant to the boys' public reputations than a private legal settlement reached quietly out of public view. Public figures facing a credible defamation threat sometimes do choose to retract or clarify a specific statement rather than risk the cost, both financial and reputational, of a drawn-out lawsuit, a choice that is not, in itself, an admission that everything the speaker said was false, but is very often, in practice, treated by the public exactly as if it were one. Whether that happens here, and on what terms, remains to be seen. Let's take a moment to return to the podcast appearance that opened up so much of this discussion, the interview Christine Wells Wansley and her husband gave, seated with a nationally known pastor, discussing Ben Crump's involvement, the perceived slowness of institutional response, and the emotional toll of returning to ordinary work while still processing this loss. Podcast interviews like this one have become, over the past several years, one of the primary vehicles through which grieving families in high-profile cases tell their own version of events directly to an audience, unfiltered by traditional news editing, a genuine benefit, in that it lets a family speak in their own words rather than through a reporter's paraphrase, and a genuine risk, in that unscripted, emotionally raw conversation, stripped of any editorial gatekeeping, can produce statements that later get parsed, clipped, and scrutinized far more harshly than a carefully worded press release ever would be. Nearly every specific claim discussed in this video that originates from that podcast, the prayer, Crump's team not reaching out first, the difficulty returning to work, comes from that same unfiltered format, which is worth remembering any time a single sentence from that conversation gets treated, in either direction, as more conclusive than an informal, emotional conversation was ever built to be. Let's talk about the reward money mentioned in connection with this case. The $50,000 Sharpton pledged at Nolan's funeral for information about the circumstances of his death, which Tyler Perry then matched, bringing the total to $100,000. Rewards like this are a common tool in stalled or high-attention investigations, intended to surface tips that witnesses might otherwise hesitate to come forward with. It's worth understanding, in general terms, both what rewards accomplish and what they distort. On the useful side, a meaningful reward can genuinely motivate a witness sitting on real, relevant information, someone who saw something on one of those dozens of boats that day and has simply never been asked to come forward with it. On the distorting side, rewards of this size, especially in cases that have already gone viral, tend to generate a flood of unreliable tips from people motivated more by the payout than by actual first-hand knowledge, which investigators then have to sort through and rule out, consuming real investigative time and resources on leads that ultimately go nowhere. Whether this specific reward has produced anything substantive is not something that's been publicly reported as of this video. It's also worth naming the role independent citizen journalists and leakers, referenced in this case, through a specific individual's name circulating in connection with an early leak of the defamation letter, increasingly play in cases like this one. Before formal news outlets often even confirm a document's existence, independent reporters working primarily through social media and newsletter platforms frequently obtain and publish leaked filings, letters, and records well ahead of traditional media, reshaping the pace at which a case's actual paper trail becomes public. This has real upsides. Documents that might otherwise stay locked in an attorney's file for weeks reach public scrutiny almost immediately, which can meaningfully speed up public accountability. It also carries real risk. Documents obtained and circulated outside any formal verification process can be selectively excerpted, taken out of context, or in rare but documented cases, entirely fabricated, and an audience conditioned to trust a familiar independent reporter's account may not apply the same scrutiny to that account that they would to a traditional outlet with formal editorial standards. Neither of those observations is a specific claim about the leak in this case. It's general context for understanding why so much of this case's paper trail has entered public view through informal channels rather than a courtroom or a press office. Let's close by returning one more time to something worth repeating because it's the single most important sentence in this entire video. An 18-year-old is dead, and every adult and institution discussed in this video, the family, the attorneys, the pastors, the commentators, the investigators, exists at least in theory because of that fact and in service of eventually understanding it fully. It is entirely possible to watch this case unfold online for months, absorbing dozens of hours of commentary, arguments about race, arguments about money, and a genuinely serious defamation dispute, without ever encountering more than a paragraph's worth of information about who Nolan Wells actually was as a person before any of this began. That imbalance is not unique to this case. It is, unfortunately, close to the default outcome whenever a death becomes this viral, this fast. The argument about the death outgrows the person who died almost every single time, regardless of who's ultimately proven right about any of the surrounding disputes. That last point, fabricated documents circulating online, serious enough that state officials felt compelled to publicly warn people away from them, deserves one more moment of attention because it's a genuinely different category of problem than everything else we've discussed. Misattributed video, an out-of-context photo, an overconfident pundit, all of that is bad, but it's the ordinary, familiar texture of how a fast-moving case gets covered badly. A fabricated official document is something else, a deliberate fake, built specifically to be mistaken for a real piece of this investigation, designed to deceive rather than merely to mislead through carelessness or bias. If you encounter a document connected to this case online, a leaked report, an alleged internal memo, anything claiming to be from the sheriff's office, the coroner, or the DA, the burden should be on that document to prove it's real before you share it, not on the rest of us to prove it's fake after the fact. In a case already this saturated with genuine, good faith uncertainty, deliberately fabricated evidence is the one category of content that deserves zero benefit of the doubt. Before we wrap up, here's a practical way to hold a case like this one the next time it, or something like it, crosses your feed. A small set of questions worth asking of any specific claim before you accept or repeat it, regardless of which side it seems to favor. Is this being presented as an open question or as a settled fact? If it's a fact, what specific document, record, or on-the-record statement is it actually sourced to, rather than a lot of people are saying? Does the person making this claim have something to gain, attention, donations, legal advantage, engagement revenue from you believing it? And critically, would you still find this claim convincing if it were made about the other side of this dispute instead? That last question in particular tends to be the fastest way to catch a double standard you didn't realize you were applying. A piece of evidence that feels damning when it's used against one side and feels like an obvious non-issue when the exact same kind of evidence gets raised about the other. None of that requires you to stop having opinions about this case. It just asks you to notice which of your opinions are actually resting on something solid and which ones are resting mostly on which commentator you happen to watch first. Now, where does this actually go from here? The official autopsy is complete, its findings sealed, awaiting presentation to a grand jury that has not yet concluded its review. That remains the single most important open thread in this entire case, because whatever that grand jury does or doesn't do will shape every legal track that follows. The defamation matter against Reverend Sharpton, if it proceeds past the demand letter stage into an actual filed lawsuit, would open its own separate civil track, running on its own timeline. Ben Hudson's stated intent to pursue his own legal action against Ben Crump would, if it materializes, open a third, entirely distinct front, a private citizen suing one of the country's most prominent civil rights attorneys directly, rather than a media figure. Any wrongful death claim the Wells family may or may not choose to pursue, and against whom, remains entirely speculative as of this video. The Congressional Black Caucus's request for a Department of Justice review sits as a fourth, federal-level possibility, not yet confirmed as opened. And the online argument over race, money, and motive that has consumed so much of this case's public life will, in all likelihood, keep running largely independent of all four of those actual legal processes, because outrage moves faster than courts do, and it always will. Let's go back to where we started. An 18-year-old named Nolan Wells stayed behind on an island while his friends headed home, and never made it back himself. Almost everything that's happened since, the money, the lawsuit threat, the sermons, the pushback, the threats against people on every side of this, happened because of that one, still not fully explained fact. We don't know, with the certainty this video's comment section is going to demand anyway, exactly what filled the hours between his friends leaving and whatever happened to him after, and we're not going to pretend otherwise just to give this video a tidier ending than the facts currently allow. Nobody outside that investigation does yet, and anyone telling you otherwise on either side of this is telling you more than they actually know. What we do know is that everyone who actually loved him, his family, and by every account so far, the friends now fighting a defamation battle to clear their names, agrees on one thing underneath all the noise. They want to know what happened to him too. That single point of agreement is easy to lose entirely in a fight this loud, buried under everything else this video has spent the last hour walking through. It's worth remembering it's still there. If this is a case you want to keep following, the grand jury's decision, whether this defamation matter turns into an actual filed lawsuit, whatever comes next for the family and for these three young men, subscribing is the only way you'll see the update the moment it's actually covered here, rather than stumbling across a fragment of it weeks later. Hit that button before you close this video out. If you take one practical thing away from this video, an hour and a great deal of documented detail after we first told you about a boat pulling away from an island without one of its passengers, let it be this. The next time a case like this one, a death, a viral fundraiser, a racial or political fight layered on top of a real tragedy, crosses your feed, resist the pull to pick a team within the first hour. Wait for the autopsy. Wait for the charges, or the declination. Wait for the actual document instead of the clip describing the document, and wait for the second and third source confirming it before you repeat it to anyone else as settled fact. It will cost you nothing to wait, and it will make you considerably harder to manipulate by anyone, pundit, attorney, or platform algorithm who benefits from you deciding quickly and loudly. That's not a call to stop caring, and it's not a call to sit on the sidelines pretending neutrality is the same thing as honesty. Nolan Wells' death deserves exactly the level of sustained, careful attention this video has tried to give it. It's a call to make sure the caring stays pointed at the actual truth of what happened to him, rather than at whichever version of this story made you angriest the fastest, because he is the one person in this entire story who never got a vote in any of it. Thank you for sticking with this one through to the end. Cases like this don't resolve on a comment section's timeline, and they don't deserve to be flattened into whichever side yells loudest that week, no matter how satisfying that flattening feels in the moment it's happening. Somewhere tonight, a mother is still grieving a son she is never getting back. Somewhere tonight, three young men are living under a cloud of public suspicion they say, through their own attorneys, they did nothing to deserve. Somewhere tonight, a judge who happens to be related to one of them is living with threats to her own safety over a case she has no official role in whatsoever. And somewhere underneath all of it is an 18-year-old who, whatever else this case becomes, deserves to be remembered as more than the reason a summer's worth of adults argued about race, money, and blame online, a teammate, a son, a friend who stayed a little longer to say goodbye to someone, on a day that should have ended like every other day that summer had. We'll be back the moment there's real news to report on this case, not before. Until then, hold the whole shape of this story rather than the flattened one. Not the villain and not the hero, just an 18-year-old who deserved to make it home from the water that day, and a summer's worth of adults, on every side, who still owe him a real answer. Take care of each other, and take care with each other's stories too. I'll see you in the next one.